I'm Emma Richardson, 28, and 6 months ago I was living what I thought was the perfect life married to my college sweetheart David. 6 months pregnant with our first child and planning our future in the beautiful home his family had gifted. US. Then everything shattered in one devastating night when David died in a car accident, leaving me alone and grieving. But the real nightmare began at his funeral when my mother-in-law Margaret looked at my growing belly and said the words that still haunt me. That mistake is what killed our son. If you hadn't gotten pregnant, David would still be alive. What followed was a campaign of cruelty that nearly destroyed me until I discovered something that changed everything. But before I tell you how I got my revenge, let me take you back to where it all began. Like and subscribe if you've ever faced family betrayal, because the story is about to get wild. I met David Richardson during my sophomore year at Northwestern University. I was studying education, dreaming of becoming a teacher, when this gorgeous guy with kind brown eyes sat next to me in our American literature class. He had this habit of doodling in the margins of his notebook little cartoon characters that made me smile even during the most boring lectures. "You're Emma, right?" He'd whispered during our third class together. "I'm David. Want to grab coffee after this and discuss how Fitzgerald probably never intended for us to analyze every single comma in The Great Gatsby." That coffee date turned into dinner, which turned into late night walks around campus, which turned into the most beautiful love story I'd ever experienced. David wasn't just handsome, he was genuinely kind. The type of person who'd stop to help someone pick up dropped books or remember your coffee order after hearing it once. He came from money, that much was obvious. The Richardson family owned several successful businesses in Chicago, and David never had to worry about student loans or working part-time jobs like I did. But he never made me feel less than because of my middle-class background. Instead, he'd insist on paying for our dates while making it seem natural. Never condescending. During our junior year, David started leaving me little handwritten notes. They'd show up everywhere, tucked into my textbooks, slipped under my dorm room door, even taped to my car windshield. "Thinking of you during this boring board meeting with Dad," one read. "Can't wait to hear about your student teaching today," said another. I kept every single one in a shoebox under my bed, treasuring these glimpses into his heart. His family welcomed me warmly, at least in the beginning. Margaret Richardson was elegant and sophisticated, the kind of woman who hosted charity luncheons and always looked perfectly put together. Robert, David's father, was quieter but seemed kind enough. They'd invite me to family dinners at their magnificent Lake Forest mansion, where I'd feel simultaneously grateful and intimidated by the crystal chandelier and formal dining room. "Emma's going to be a teacher," David would announce proudly. At these dinners, "She's amazing with kids. You should see her in the classroom during her practicum." Margaret would smile, that polite smile I'd later recognize as barely concealed condescension. "How nice, dear." Teaching is such a noble profession, but David believed in me. He'd drive to my student teaching assignments just to take me out. For lunch afterward, listening intently as I gushed about lesson plans and classroom management. When I landed my first real teaching job at Lincoln Elementary, he showed up at my apartment with champagne and roses. "I'm so proud of you," he'd whispered, spinning me around my tiny kitchen. "You're going to change so many kids' lives." We got married the summer after graduation in a beautiful ceremony at his family's country club. I wore my grandmother's dress, and David cried when he saw me walking down the aisle. His vows were perfect promises about growing old together, supporting each other's dreams, and building a family filled with love and laughter. The reception was elegant, everything Margaret had planned down to the last detail. But the moment I treasured most was during our first dance, when David whispered in my ear, "I can't believe you're my wife. I'm the luckiest man alive." We moved into a charming starter home in Evanston, Nothing fancy, but perfect for us. David had started working at his father's company, though he often mentioned wanting to eventually start his own business. I left my teaching job, and we'd spend evenings grading papers together. David helping me cut out bulletin board decorations while I quizzed him on quarterly reports. 2 years into our marriage, I missed my period. The pregnancy test showed 2 pink lines, and I stared at it in disbelief before running to find David. He was in the garage, working on refinishing an old dresser we'd found at a flea market. "David," I said, my voice shaking with excitement and terror. He looked up, saw my face, and immediately set down his sandpaper. "What is it, Em?" I held up the test. The joy that spread across his face was pure magic. He picked me up and spun me around, both of us laughing and crying at the same time. "We're having a baby," he kept repeating. "We're really having a baby." That's when his parents surprised us with the house. It was a beautiful colonial in Winnetka with 4 bedrooms, a nursery that Margaret had already started planning, and a backyard perfect for children. The deed was transferred into both our names, a wedding gift they'd been planning, they said. "Every child deserves to grow up in a real home," Margaret had said, her hand resting on my still flat belly. "This baby will be a Richardson after all." I should have paid more attention to the way she said Richardson, like it was the title that came with conditions, but I was too happy, too grateful, too in love with my husband and excited about our future to notice the warning signs. David was over the moon about becoming a father. He'd already started reading parenting books, researching the best car seats, and talking to the baby every night when we went to bed. "Daddy loves you already," he'd whisper to my growing bump. "We can't wait to meet you." Those were the golden months when everything felt perfect and our future stretched ahead of us bright with possibility. It was a Tuesday night in October when my world shattered. I remember because I'd spent the day at school helping my 3rd graders with their Halloween costume parade practice, and I was exhausted. At 6 months pregnant, I was at that stage where my back ached constantly and my feet swelled by afternoon. All I wanted was to curl up on the couch with David and watch something mindless on TV. David had texted me around 4 p.m., saying he'd be home late, something about a client dinner that his father had insisted he attend. I'd responded with a tired emoji and told him I'd save him some of the lasagna I was making. He'd sent back 3 heart emojis and "Love you, Em. Can't wait to come home to my girls." I'd smiled at that. He'd started calling the baby our girl, even though we didn't know the sex yet. Father's intuition, he'd insist whenever I teased him about it. I fell asleep on the couch, watching a cooking show, one hand resting on my bump where the baby had been particularly active that evening. I dreamed about David walking through the door, kissing my forehead, and carrying me upstairs like he always did. When I fell asleep downstairs, the phone rang at 11:47 p.m. I know the exact time because I stared at the clock, confused and disoriented, wondering why anyone would call so late. My first thought was that it might be David. Maybe his phone had died and he was calling from the restaurant. "Mrs. Richardson?" The voice was professional, careful. "This is Officer Martinez with the Chicago Police Department." My blood turned to ice. You know that feeling when your body realizes something terrible before your mind catches up? That's what happened. My hand instinctively went to my belly, as if protecting the baby from whatever was coming. "There's been an accident," the officer continued, and I could hear the practiced gentleness in her voice, the tone they must teach all cops for these awful calls. "Your husband was involved in a collision on Lakeshore Drive. You need to come to Northwestern Memorial Hospital immediately." The rest of the conversation was a blur. I remember asking if he was okay, and the pause, that terrible telling pause before she said they'd give me more information at the hospital. I remember throwing on clothes, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't zip my jacket. I remember the surreal experience of driving through empty streets, my mind racing between prayer and terror. The emergency room was too bright, too sterile, too full of people having the worst nights of their lives. A nurse led me to a small room with uncomfortable chairs and a box of tissues on the table. That's when I knew. You don't put people in rooms like that to give them good news. Dr. Hassan was kind but direct. David had been hit by a drunk driver who ran a red light. The impact was severe. They'd done everything they could, but the injuries were too extensive. He was pronounced dead at 11:23 p.m. I didn't cry at first. I just sat there, staring at this doctor who was telling me my husband was gone, and I felt nothing. Complete numbness. The baby gave a strong kick, as if reminding me that life was still growing inside me even as my world collapsed. "Can I see him?" I whispered. They led me to another room where David lay on a hospital bed, looking peaceful except for the bandages and the unnatural stillness. I took his hand still warm and talked to him like he could hear me. I told him about the babies, kicks during dinner, about the Halloween decorations I'd put up that weekend, about how much I loved him. I told him I didn't know how to do this without him. The worst part was calling his parents. Margaret answered on the first ring as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "Margaret, it's Emma. There's been an accident." "What kind of accident?" Her voice was sharp, immediately alert. "David was hit by a drunk driver. He's gone, Margaret. David is dead." The scream that came through the phone was inhuman. I heard the phone drop, heard Robert's voice in the background, heard the chaos as they processed what I just told them. When Margaret got back on the phone, her voice was different, cold, accusatory. "Where were you? Why weren't you with him?" "I was at home. He was at a client dinner. He should have been home with you. If he hadn't been working so late, if you hadn't been demanding so much of his time with this pregnancy..." The line went dead. I sat in that hospital room until dawn, holding David's hand and feeling our baby move inside me. The nurses were kind, bringing me water and checking on me regularly. One of them, an older woman named Carol, sat with me for a while. "Honey," she said gently, "you need to think about your baby. This kind of shock, this stress, it's not good for either of you. Do you have someone who can come get you?" I realized with horrible clarity that I didn't know who to call. My parents had died in a car accident when I was in college. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. My sister lived in California. David's family blamed me. My closest friends from work would come if I asked, but it felt too enormous to explain over the phone. Drive home as the sun rose was the loneliest journey of my life. The house looked exactly the same. David's coffee mug still in the sink from yesterday morning. His jacket thrown over the back of a chair. The nursery we'd started painting last weekend still half finished. I walked through our home, touching things he'd touched, smelling his cologne on his pillow, and finally understanding that he was never coming back. The baby kicked again, and I realized with a mix of comfort and terror that I wasn't completely alone. I still had this piece of David growing inside me, but I also realized, as I sat in our empty bedroom clutching the hospital bracelet they'd given me as his next of kin, that the hardest part was just beginning. Because Margaret's words on the phone had been clear. Somehow, this is my fault. The baby kicked again, and I whispered to my belly, "It's okay, little one. Daddy loved you so much. We're going to be okay." I had no idea how wrong I was. The funeral was held on a gray Saturday morning at St. Mary's, the same church where David and I had been married just 3 years earlier. I sat in the front pew wearing the only black dress that still fit over my growing belly, feeling like an imposter in my own grief. Margaret had taken complete control of the arrangements, which I'd initially been grateful for. In those first few days after David's death, I could barely function. I'd spent most of my time in bed, alternating between sobbing and staring at nothing, while well-meaning neighbors dropped off casseroles I couldn't bring myself to eat. But when I saw the funeral program, my blood ran cold. David's photo smiled from the front cover, surrounded by beautiful script detailing his life. Beloved son of Margaret and Robert Richardson. Devoted brother to Michael and Sarah. Cherished friend to many. There was no mention of me, no mention of our marriage, no mention of the baby he'd been so excited to meet. I was erased. There must be some mistake, I told the funeral director. When I arrived early that morning, I'm his wife. We're having a baby. I'm sorry, ma'am, but Mrs. Richardson Sr. handled all the arrangements. If you'd like to make changes, you'll need to speak with her directly. I found Margaret in the church's family room, accepting condolences from a stream of visitors. She looked elegant in her grief, her silver hair perfectly styled, her black suit impeccable. When she saw me approaching, her expression hardened. Emma, I wasn't sure you'd come. Wasn't sure I'd come? Margaret, he was my husband. Was he? Her voice was cold, calculated, because looking at this program, looking at how he spent his final months working himself to death, trying to provide for your demands, I'm beginning to wonder if this marriage was the biggest mistake he ever made. The people around us had gone, quiet, sensing the tension. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, partly from embarrassment and partly from anger. How dare you? How dare I what? Tell the truth. My son is dead because he was working late trying to support a wife who couldn't be. Satisfied with what they had. He should have been home safe instead of driving around the city at nearly midnight because you needed a bigger house, better things, more money for this baby. That's not true. David loved me. He loved this baby, Margaret's. Voice dropped to a vicious whisper, is the mistake that killed our son. If you hadn't gotten pregnant, David wouldn't have felt pressured to work so hard. He wouldn't have been on that road. He'd still be alive. I felt like she'd slap me. Around us, family, friends, and relatives shifted uncomfortably, some nodding, in agreement with Margaret's words. I recognized some faces from our wedding, people who'd smiled and congratulated us, now looking at me with suspicion and blame. That's enough. A firm voice cut through the tension. David's cousin Lisa stepped between Margaret and me, her face flushed with anger. Aunt Margaret, this is inappropriate. Emma just lost her husband, and I lost my son. Margaret's composure cracked for just a moment, revealing the raw grief underneath. But instead of making her more sympathetic, it made her more dangerous. My brilliant, kind, successful son who threw his life away on someone who trapped him with a pregnancy and then demanded more than he could give. The funeral service itself was a blur of hymns and eulogies that painted David as a devoted son and promising businessman, but barely acknowledged the life we'd built together. When people spoke about his future, they talked about the potential. He'd never realized the family business he'd never inherit. No one mentioned our baby, our dreams, our love. I tried to speak during the open eulogy time, but when I stood up, Margaret's voice cut across the church. I think we've heard enough. Let's proceed with the final blessing. The burial was worse. At the graveside, Margaret stood at the head of the casket like a chief mourner, while I was relegated to the side, invisible in my grief. When people approached to offer condolences, they went to her first, often ignoring me entirely. He was such a good boy, one elderly woman said to Margaret. It's such a shame about, well, the situation he was in. The situation, as if my marriage to David, our baby, our love was just an unfortunate circumstance that had led to his death. After the burial, there was a reception at the Richardson family home. I almost didn't go, but Lisa convinced me I needed to be there. Don't let them erase you, she said firmly. David loved you. Everyone who really knew him could see that. Don't let grief and blame rewrite your story. But at the reception, I felt like a ghost haunting my own husband's funeral. People spoke around me, not to me. When someone did acknowledge, it was with the kind of pity you'd give to someone who'd brought their troubles on themselves. I overheard Margaret talking to a group of David's business associates. Of course, we'll be taking care of the arrangements. Emma is so young, and with the baby coming, well, she's not really equipped to handle David's affairs. It's better if family handles these things. What arrangements? I interrupted, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. Margaret turned to me with that cold smile. Oh, Emma, we were just discussing the house. Obviously, with David gone, there's no need for you to stay in such a large place. We think it would be better for everyone if you move somewhere more appropriate for your situation, my situation, a single mother, limited income. You'll want something smaller, more affordable. We'll help you find a nice apartment, of course. The room had gone quiet again. I felt the weight of everyone's stares, the judgment, the assumption that I was some kind of gold digger who'd lost her meal ticket. The house is in both our names, I said quietly. David made sure of that. Legal technicalities can be complicated. Robert spoke for the first time that day, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to getting his way, especially when there are family considerations involved. I left the reception early, Lisa, walking me to my car. Don't let them intimidate you, she said, hugging me carefully around my belly. David loved you and this baby. He'd be furious if he could see how they're treating you. But what if they're right? I whispered. What if he really did die because of me? Because of this pregnancy? Stop. Lisa gripped my shoulders firmly. David died because a drunk driver ran a red light, period. Not because he loved you, not because you were having his baby. Because someone else made a terrible choice that night. As I drove home to my empty house, Margaret's words echoed in my head. The mistake that killed our son. I placed my hand on my belly, feeling the baby move, and made a promise. They're wrong about you, little one, I whispered. Daddy wanted you so much. You're not a mistake. You're the most beautiful part of him that I still have. But deep down, a poisonous seed of doubt had been planted. And I was beginning to realize that the Richardson family's cruelty was just getting started. The first eviction notice arrived exactly 1 week after the funeral. I was sitting at the kitchen table, still in my pajamas at 2 p.m., staring at a sympathy card from one of my students' parents when the doorbell rang. A process server stood on my front porch with a manila envelope and a clipboard. Emma Richardson, yes, you're being served. Have a good day, ma'am. My hands shook as I opened the envelope. The legal language was dense and intimidating, but the message was crystal clear. I had 30 days to vacate the premises. According to the documents, the house had never been legally transferred to David and me. It remained Richardson family property, and as I was not a blood relative, I had no right to continue living there. I read the notice 3 times before the words sank in. Then I ran upstairs to our bedroom, my bedroom now, and pulled out the filing cabinet where David kept all our important documents. Our copy of the deed was right there, clearly showing both our names. David Richardson and Emma Richardson, joint ownership, transferred as a gift in March. But as I stared at the official-looking eviction notice, doubt crept in. Had we been living in their house all this time under some kind of arrangement I didn't understand? David had handled all the legal paperwork. I trusted him completely, maybe too completely. I called the number on the letterhead. A crisp, professional voice answered, Hartman, Stevens, and Associates. Hi, this is Emma Richardson. I received an eviction notice today, and I think there might be some mistake, Mrs. Richardson. I'm afraid there's no mistake. Our clients, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Richardson, are the legal owners of the property at 1247 Maple Street. The previous arrangement with their deceased son was informal and has been terminated. But I have a deed. It shows both my husband's and my name. Ma'am, I'd recommend you have that document examined by your own attorney. Our client's documentation clearly establishes their ownership rights. The line went dead. I spent the rest of the afternoon on the phone calling legal aid societies and family lawyers, most of whom wanted retainer fees I couldn't afford or had waiting lists weeks long. One paralegal I finally reached was sympathetic but not encouraging. Property disputes can be complicated, especially when there's a death involved, she explained. If the other party has good lawyers and documentation and you're not sure about your legal standing, it could be an expensive fight with no guarantee of success. That evening, Margaret called. Her voice was sickeningly sweet, like she was doing me a favor. Emma dear, I hope you received our notice. I know it seems harsh, but we really think this is for the best. That house is far too big for just you and a baby. The utilities alone must be overwhelming for someone in your ... position. My position. Well, you're not working now, are you? And with David gone, I assume money will be tight. We found several lovely little apartments that would be much more suitable. One-bedroom places, very affordable. Margaret, this is my home. David and I chose this house together. We painted the nursery. Oh, sweetheart. Her voice turned. Patronizing. I know this is difficult, but you need to be realistic. You can't afford to maintain a house like this on a teacher's salary, especially with a baby coming. We're trying to help you make a graceful transition before things get ... unpleasant. Are you threatening me? Of course not. We're family. We just want what's best for everyone. The house has sentimental value to us, you understand? It's where David grew up visiting, where he played as a child. We'd like to keep it in the family. I am family. I was David's wife. The pause was long and loaded. Were you, though? I mean, legally speaking, after what's happened, you're a widow now, dear. That changes things. After she hung up, I sat in the nursery David and I had started preparing. We'd painted one wall, a soft yellow, convinced we'd finish the rest after we learned the baby's gender. David's stepladder still stood in the corner, a paintbrush balanced on the rim of the paint can he'd promised to finish next weekend. The baby kicked hard as, if responding to my stress. I'd been having more Braxton Hicks contractions lately, false labor pains that my doctor said were normal, but concerning given the emotional trauma I'd been through. Don't worry, little one, I whispered, rubbing my belly. Mommy's going to figure this out, but as the days passed, the campaign against me intensified. The Richardson family seemed to have endless resources and a coordinated strategy. I received calls from David's life insurance company questioning the beneficiary designation. The bank called about our joint checking account, saying there were complications with my access to the funds. Even our shared credit cards were suddenly frozen. There are concerns about the account holder's death certificate processing. The bank representative explained in that carefully neutral tone that probably meant Margaret had been making calls. I had to use my own meager savings to buy groceries and pay the utilities. My principal at Lincoln Elementary had been understanding about my grief leave, but I knew I'd need to return to work soon, except I had no idea if I'd have a home to return to. The worst part was the isolation. David's friends, people who'd been at our wedding, who'd celebrated with us when we announced the pregnancy, stopped returning my calls. I later learned through Lisa that Margaret had been spreading her version of events, that I'd been demanding and materialistic, that I pressured David into financial commitments he couldn't handle, that his death was essentially the tragic result of a young man trying to please a wife who was never satisfied. She's telling people you were threatening to leave him if he didn't buy you a bigger house. Lisa told me during one of her secret visits. She's saying the only reason he was at that client dinner was because he'd been complaining about money. That's not true. David loved his work. He was excited about providing for our family, but it was his choice. I know that. Anyone who really knew David knows that. But grief makes people want someone to blame, and you're an easy target. The stress was affecting my pregnancy in ways that terrified me. I'd wake up with severe cramping, and twice I'd had to go to the emergency room thinking I might be going into premature labor. Both times, the doctors warned me that stress could trigger early delivery or other complications. Mrs. Richardson, Dr. Martinez said after my second A visit, I need you to understand how serious this is. You're at 28 weeks now. If these stress-induced contractions continue, we could be looking at a very premature birth. Is there something going on at home that's causing this level of anxiety? I wanted to tell her everything, but I was afraid it would sound crazy. A grieving widow convinced her in-laws were trying to steal her home and her husband's money. It sounded paranoid even to me. 3 weeks after the first eviction notice, I found Margaret standing in my backyard when I came home from a prenatal appointment. She was with a man in an expensive suit, and they were pointing at different parts of the house, talking in low voices. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice shaky with anger and fear. "This is private property. You can't just—" "Actually, dear, it's not." Margaret turned to me with that cold smile. "We're having the house inspected for some necessary repairs. As the owners, it's our responsibility to maintain the property. I live here. You can't just come into my yard without permission." The man in the suit stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm Jeff Morrison, property assessor. I have authorization from the legal owners to conduct this inspection." He held up an official-looking clipboard. I stood there, 6 months pregnant and exhausted, facing two people who were systematically dismantling my life while acting like they were doing me a favor. The baby gave a particularly strong kick, as if she could sense my distress. "This ends now," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "And calling my lawyer?" Margaret laughed, actually laughed. "Oh, Emma, you can't afford a lawyer. We both know that. But if you insist on making this difficult, we can certainly make things more complicated for you." As they walked away, I heard her say to the assessor, "It's such a shame when people don't know their place. But don't worry, this will all be resolved soon." That night, sitting alone in the house that might not be mine much longer, I realized the Richardson family wasn't just trying to take my home. They were trying to erase me entirely, to pretend David's marriage and his baby were just inconvenient mistakes that needed to be corrected. But they'd made one crucial error in their campaign of cruelty. They'd underestimated how far a mother will go to protect her child. And David's daughter deserved better than to have her father's memory poisoned by their lies. It was time to fight back. The next morning, I woke up with a determination I hadn't felt since David's death. The baby had been restless all night, kicking and shifting as if she could sense my anxiety, and I'd finally realized that my stress was affecting both of us. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, waiting for the Richardson family to destroy what was left of my life. I started in David's home office, a small room off our bedroom where he'd handled all our personal business. I'd avoided it since his death, partly because it still smelled like his cologne, and partly because seeing his handwriting on old notes and calendars was too painful. But now I needed answers. David had always been meticulous about documentation. "Never trust that important papers won't get lost," he used to say. "Always keep copies of everything." I teased him about being paranoid, but now I was grateful for his thoroughness. I pulled out every file, every folder, every envelope. Bank statements, insurance policies, warranties for appliances, tax returns. David had kept it all organized in clearly labeled sections. And there, in a folder marked House, Legal Documents, I found what I was looking for. The original property deed was there, exactly as I remembered it. David Richardson and Emma Richardson, joint tenants with right of survivorship. The transfer had been completed on March 15th, 2 months after we'd moved in. But more importantly, there was something else in the folder, a letter from David's personal attorney, James Chun, confirming the transfer and discussing something called a gift tax exemption that his parents had signed. My hands shook as I read the letter. It was dated just 2 weeks before David's death, and it mentioned a phone call where David had expressed concerns about potential family complications and wanted to ensure all documentation was ironclad and beyond dispute. Had David somehow known his family might try to take the house away from me? I kept digging through the files, and that's when I found the manila envelope hidden behind the hanging folders, labeled in David's handwriting, "For Emma, important." Inside was a life insurance policy I'd never seen before. Not the one through his work that I knew about, but a private policy he'd taken out just after we got married. The beneficiary was listed as Emma Richardson, wife, and any children born of this marriage. The death benefit was $500,000. $500,000. I stared at the number, hardly believing it. David had never mentioned this policy. The monthly premiums had been automatically deducted from an account I didn't even know existed, but there was more. The envelope contained bank statements for something called Richardson Family Trust, David's account. Every month for the past 3 years, David had been depositing money into this account. The final balance was over $75. My mind raced. If David had all this money, if he'd been planning for our future so carefully, why was Margaret claiming we were a financial burden? Why was she saying he'd been working himself to death to support us? I called the phone number on the insurance policy letterhead. Meridian Life Insurance, this is Janet speaking. Hi, this is Emma Richardson. My husband David passed away recently, and I'm calling about his life insurance policy. I'm so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Richardson. Let me pull up his file. I heard typing in the background. Yes, I have his information here. The death claim was filed, but there's been a hold placed on the payout pending some kind of family dispute. Do you have an attorney representing you? A hold? What kind of hold? It shows here that another party has claimed to be the rightful beneficiary and has requested an investigation into the policy's validity. This is unusual, but not unheard of when there are family conflicts after a death. I felt sick. Who filed the dispute? I'm not supposed to share that information, but since you're listed as the primary beneficiary, it was filed by a Margaret Richardson, claiming to be the deceased's mother and next of kin. After hanging up, I sat in David's chair, surrounded by evidence of his love and planning for our future, and finally understood what was happening. This wasn't just grief-driven cruelty. This was a calculated attempt to steal everything David had left for me and our baby, but Margaret had made one mistake. She'd assumed I was too young, too naive, and too overwhelmed by grief to fight back effectively. She'd underestimated what David had taught me about being thorough and keeping records. I called the number on James Chun's letterhead. Chun and Associates. How may I help you? This is Emma Richardson. I need to speak with James Chun about my husband David's estate. It's urgent. I'm sorry, Mrs. Richardson, but Mr. Chun is no longer handling any Richardson family matters. There was some kind of conflict of interest that arose after your husband's death. What kind of conflict? I really can't say more than that, ma'am. You might want to contact the Richardson family's current attorney. I hung up, more confused than ever. David's own lawyer had been forced off the case. What kind of power did the Richardson family have? I spent the rest of the morning making copies of every document I'd found, hiding the originals in different places around the house in case Margaret decided to search through David's things. Then I called Lisa. Can you meet me somewhere? Not here, not at your house. Somewhere neutral. Emma, you're scaring me. What's going on? I found some things. Documents that David left for me. I think your aunt and uncle have been lying about everything. We met at a coffee shop downtown, far from the Richardson family's usual haunts. Lisa's face grew more and more angry as I showed her copies of the documents I'd found. That insurance policy alone proves David was planning for your future, she said, flipping through the bank statements. Look at these regular deposits. He was saving money every month for you and the baby. This isn't the behavior of someone who was financially stressed. But why would Margaret lie? What does she gain from making me look like I was a burden to David? Lisa was quiet for a long moment, staring at the trust fund statements. Emma, I need to tell you something. Something I probably should have told you before, but I didn't want to hurt you more than you were already hurting. My heart sank. What? At the funeral reception, I overheard Aunt Margaret talking to Uncle Robert about David's will. She was furious about something, saying that David had made arrangements that would complicate everything and that they needed to handle the situation carefully. What kind of arrangements? I don't know. But she mentioned something about David changing his will recently and that it would take time to sort out. Emma, I think there might be more documents you haven't found yet. I thought about James Chen being forced off the case, about the insurance company hold, about Margaret's confidence that she could take the house away from me. Where would David hide something really important? Something he wouldn't want his family to find? Lisa smiled sadly. You knew him better than anyone. Where did he always say was the safest place to keep something? I thought about all the times David had joked about his hiding places. His elaborate security measures for everything from Christmas presents to important documents. And then I remembered the safety deposit box, the bank, I whispered. He always said the only place safer than our house was the bank. We drove to First National, where David and I had our checking account. I'd never accessed the safety deposit box before. David had always handled that, but as his wife, I should have access rights. Mrs. Richardson, the bank manager, Mr. Foster, greeted me with obvious discomfort. I'm very sorry for your loss. How can I help you today? I'd like to access our safety deposit box, please. His expression grew even more uncomfortable. Ma'am, I'm afraid there might be some complications with that. We've received some conflicting information about access rights since your husband's passing. What kind of conflicting information? Well, we've been contacted by the Richardson family's attorney claiming that the box was part of a family trust and that access should be restricted pending an estate review. I felt the familiar surge of anger and fear. Mr. Foster, I'm David's wife. My name is on the rental agreement. I have every legal right to access that box. You're absolutely right, and I apologize for the confusion. Let me just verify your identification and we'll get this sorted out. 10 minutes later, I sat in a private room with a metal box that contained whatever David had thought was important enough to hide. My hands shook as I lifted the lid. Inside was a sealed envelope addressed to me in David's handwriting. From my beloved Emma, in case something happens to me. Below, that was a stack of legal documents, another copy of his will, and something that made my blood run cold. A letter from a private investigator detailing Margaret Richardson's gambling debts and her history of financial fraud within the family business. I opened David's letter with trembling fingers. My darling Emma, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me and my family is probably trying to make your life hell. I know my mother better than she thinks I do. I know she's never really accepted you, and I know she used my death as an excuse to try to take everything away from you and our baby. Don't let her. You and our child are my real family now, and I've made sure you'll have everything you need to build a good life without them. Trust James Chen. He has instructions to help you, and he has information about my family that they don't want revealed. I love you more than words can say. Take care of our daughter, and yes, I'm still convinced it's a girl. Make sure she knows how much her daddy loved her. Fight for what's yours, Em. You're stronger than you know. I sat in that sterile bank room, holding my husband's final words, and finally understood the full scope of what I was up against. Margaret wasn't just grieving and lashing out. She was covering up her own financial crimes by trying to claim David's assets and paint me as the villain. But David had been one step ahead of her. And now, finally, I had the weapons I needed to fight back. Armed with David's letter and the private investigator's report, I called James Chun's office again the next morning. This time I had leverage. Mr. Chun, this is Emma Richardson. I know you've been told you can't handle Richardson family matters anymore, but I have something you need to see. Something David left specifically for me. There was a long pause. Mrs. Richardson, I'd like to help you, but I've been instructed by the senior partners that any involvement with Richardson, family affairs, could create legal complications for our firm. What if I told you I have David's private letter giving me specific instructions to contact you? And what if I told you I have documentation proving that Margaret Richardson has been lying about our financial situation? Another pause, longer this time. Can you be at my office in an hour, and Mrs. Richardson? Come alone. James Chun's law office was in a sleek downtown building, all glass and steel that spoke of success and discretion. When his secretary led me into his private office, I was struck by how different he was from the intimidating corporate lawyer I'd expected. He was probably in his 50s, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put me at ease. Mrs. Richardson, please, sit down. I'm very sorry for your loss, and I'm even more sorry for what you've been going through since David's death. I handed him David's letter first. He read it carefully, his expression growing more serious with each line. This confirms what I suspected, he said finally. David came to see me about 6 weeks before he died. He was concerned about some irregularities he'd discovered in his family's business dealings, and he wanted to make sure his personal affairs were protected. What kind of irregularities? Mr. Chun pulled out a thick file folder. David hired a private investigator to look into his mother's financial activities. What they found was quite disturbing. May I share this information with you? It's going to be difficult to hear. I nodded, steeling myself. Your mother-in-law has been embezzling money from the family businesses for over 10 years. Small amounts, at first, but increasingly larger sums. She's also developed a serious gambling addiction that she's been hiding from everyone, including her husband. David discovered this when he noticed some discrepancies in the quarterly reports and started digging deeper. My head spun. That's why she wants David's money. She needs it to cover her debts. Exactly. David estimated that she'd stolen close to $2 million over the years. He was planning to confront her after your baby was born, hoping that becoming a grandmother might motivate her to get help and make restitution. But then he died, and Margaret saw an opportunity to solve multiple problems at once. If she could claim that David's assets were rightfully part of the family estate, she could use that money to cover her embezzlement and by painting you. As a gold digger who'd been financially draining David, she deflects attention from her own crimes. I felt sick thinking about all the cruel things Margaret had said, all the ways she'd made me doubt myself and my marriage. She's been blaming me for David's death to cover up her own guilt. I'm afraid it's worse than that. Mr. Chun opened another folder. David's will, his real will, not what version Margaret may have tried to substitute, leaves everything to you and your child. The house, his personal accounts, his share of the family business, everything. But there's more. He pulled out a document I'd never seen before. 3 days before he died, David had me draw up what's called a pour-over provision that places all his assets into a trust for you and the baby. This trust has some very specific conditions attached to it. What kind of conditions? If anyone attempts to contest his will or challenge your rights to his estate, the trust automatically triggers a full forensic audit of Richardson family business accounts. David was essentially setting up a nuclear option. Anyone who tried to steal from you would expose Margaret's embezzlement. I stared at the legal document, hardly believing what I was hearing. David knew. He knew she'd try to take everything away from me. He suspected. And he loved you enough to make sure you'd be protected. Mr. Chun leaned forward, his expression serious. Mrs. Richardson, your husband left you more than just money and property. He left you the power to destroy his mother's life if she tried to destroy yours. But why haven't you done anything? Why haven't you stopped her? Mr. Chun's face darkened. Because Margaret's lawyers approached my senior, partners with threats about our firm's reputation if we continued to represent you. They claimed we had a conflict of interest since we'd done work for Richardson family businesses in the past. My partners forced me to step back from your case to avoid potential litigation. So she's been able to terrorize me because you abandoned me. Not abandoned. Strategically withdrew. Mrs. Richardson, I couldn't represent you directly, but I could make sure David's real will was safely filed with the probate court, which I did. And I could wait for you to find the documents David left for you, which would give you the power to choose your own representation. He slid a business card across the desk. This is Sarah Martinez, one of the best estate attorneys in the city. She specializes in cases involving family fraud and financial abuse. I've already briefed her on your situation, and she's agreed to take your case on a contingency basis. What does that mean? It means you don't pay unless you win. And given what David left you, Mrs. Richardson, I think you're going to win big. I looked at the card, then back at the stack of documents that proved my husband had loved me enough to protect me even after death. What happens now? Now you decide how far you want to take this. You could simply use the evidence to force Margaret to honor David's will and leave you alone, or ... He paused, choosing his words carefully. You could trigger the audit provision and expose everything she's done. That would likely result in criminal charges against her and full restitution to the family business. I thought about all the nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering if David really had died because of me. All the times Margaret had made me feel like an unwanted burden on a family that had tolerated me out of obligation. All the stress that had put my pregnancy at risk and nearly cost me my baby. She told me my child was the mistake that killed her son, I said quietly. She tried to make me believe that David died because of me. Mr. Chun's expression hardened. That woman put you and your unborn child at risk to cover up her own crimes. In my opinion, she deserves whatever consequences her actions bring. I picked up Sarah Martinez's business card. I want to meet with this attorney. I want to know all my options. I'll call her now and set up an appointment for this afternoon if possible. But Mrs. Richardson, I need to warn you once you start. This process, Margaret will realize that you're not the helpless victim she thought you were. She may escalate her attacks. Let her try, I said, feeling a strength I didn't know I possessed. David left me everything I need to fight her. And unlike her, I'm not fighting for money I stole. I'm fighting for my daughter's future. As I left Mr. Chun's office, I felt the baby kick strongly, as if she approved of my decision. For the first time since David's death, I felt like I wasn't alone in this battle. My husband had been protecting me all along, even from the grave. Margaret Richardson had made the mistake of underestimating a mother's love and a husband's devotion. Now she was about to learn exactly how expensive that mistake would be. Sarah Martinez was everything James Chun had promised, sharp, confident, and absolutely furious when she heard my story. Her office was warm and welcoming, filled with family photos and children's artwork that made me feel comfortable despite the gravity of what we were discussing. Mrs. Richardson, she said after reviewing all the documents, what's been done to you is not just cruel, it's criminal. Margaret Richardson has engaged in harassment, attempted fraud, and what appears to be a conspiracy to deprive you of your legal inheritance. What can we do about it? We're going to file an emergency motion to enforce your husband's will and stop all attempts to remove you from your home. We're also going to seek a restraining order against Margaret for harassment. And then, Sarah smiled grimly, we're going to let her know that we have evidence of her embezzlement and give her one chance to back down before we destroy her life. That afternoon, Sarah filed the paperwork. By evening, Margaret's response made it clear she had no intention of backing down quietly. I was making dinner when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw 2 police officers standing on my front porch. My heart immediately started racing. Had something happened to Lisa? Was there news about David's case, Mrs. Richardson? We're here about a complaint filed against you for trespassing and theft. Trespassing? Theft? I don't understand. The older officer, Sergeant Williams, consulted his notebook. A Mrs. Margaret Richardson claims you've been living illegally in her property and have stolen various items belonging to her deceased son. She's provided us with documentation showing ownership of this residence. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Officers, this is my home. My husband and I own this house together. I have the deed to prove it. Ma'am, we're not here to sort out property disputes. But Mrs. Richardson has also filed a complaint claiming you've been harassing her and making threats. She says she's afraid for her safety. That's impossible. She's the one who's been harassing me. The younger officer, Officer Martinez, seemed more sympathetic. Ma'am, do you have documentation proving you live here legally? I ran upstairs and grabbed copies of the deed, our marriage certificate, and some of David's personal letters that clearly showed this was our shared home. Officer Martinez reviewed them carefully while Sergeant Williams walked around our front yard, noting details. This looks legitimate, Officer Martinez said quietly. But Mrs. Richardson, I have to tell you that the other party seemed very credible and had extensive documentation. Are you sure there isn't some kind of family dispute going on here that might be confusing the situation? Yes, there's a family dispute. My mother-in-law has been trying to steal my inheritance since my husband died. But I live here legally, and I've never threatened anyone. Sergeant Williams returned from his inspection. Ma'am, we're not going to take any action today since you've provided proof of residence. But I need to inform you that if Mrs. Richardson files another complaint, we'll have to investigate more thoroughly. After they left, I called Sarah immediately. This is escalation, she said grimly. Margaret is trying to create a paper trail that makes you look unstable and criminal. We need to be prepared for more of this. She was right. Over the next week, Margaret's campaign against me intensified in ways I never could have imagined at first. She called my school. Principal Johnson called me on Tuesday morning, her voice carefully neutral. Emma, I've received some concerning phone calls about your ... situation at home. Is everything all right? What kind of phone calls? Someone claiming to be a family member expressed concerns about your mental state following your husband's death. They suggested that you might not be stable enough to return to teaching after your maternity leave. My blood ran cold. Mrs. Johnson, I'm grieving, but I'm absolutely stable. I'm 7 months pregnant and dealing with some family conflicts over my husband's estate, but I'm perfectly capable of doing my job. I'm sure you are, Emma. But I have to ask, have you been receiving any kind of counseling or therapy? Not because I doubt your capabilities, but because these phone calls mention some specific concerns about your judgment and decision-making. I realized Margaret was trying to destroy my career along with everything else. If she could get me fired, I'd have no income to fight her legal battles. Mrs. Johnson, I think these calls are part of a deliberate campaign to discredit me. My mother-in-law is trying to contest my husband's will, and she's using any tactic she can think of. Oh, Emma. Mrs. Johnson's voice warmed considerably. I was hoping it was something like that. The calls just seemed ... off. Too detailed, too insistent. Why don't you have your attorney contact our district's legal department? We can probably put a stop to this kind of harassment. The attacks weren't limited to my professional life. That Thursday, I went to the grocery store and discovered that someone had been spreading rumors throughout our neighborhood. As I walked down the cereal aisle, Mrs. Henderson from 3 houses down approached me with obvious discomfort. Emma dear, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything all right at home? Some people have been saying, well, they've been saying that you might be having some financial troubles. And with the baby coming, what people? What are they saying? Mrs. Henderson looked embarrassed. Well, Margaret Richardson stopped by yesterday. She seemed very concerned about you. She said that David had been struggling financially before he died, and that you might not be able to keep up with the house payments. She wondered if any of us neighbors had noticed signs that you might be in distress. I felt my face flush with anger and humiliation. Mrs. Henderson, I'm not in financial distress. My mother-in-law and I are having a disagreement about my husband's estate, but everything she told you is a lie. Oh dear. I was afraid it might be something like that. She just seemed so convincing, and she had all these specific details about David's work situation and your medical bills quote. That evening, Lisa called in a panic. Emma, you need to know that Aunt Margaret has been calling everyone in the family, spreading stories about you. She's telling people you've been unstable since David's death, that you've been making wild accusations against the family, and that she's worried you might hurt yourself or the baby. She's trying to make me look crazy so no one will believe me when I expose what she's done. It's worse than that. She's been showing people what she claims are medical records indicating you've been treated for depression and anxiety since David's death. I don't know how she got them, but those are fake, I said immediately. I've been to the doctor for pregnancy checkups and stress-related issues, but I've never been treated for depression. She's fabricating evidence. Emma, you need to document everything. Every phone call, every visit, every conversation. She's building a case to prove you're an unfit mother. That night, I started a journal, writing down every detail I could remember about Margaret's harassment. As I wrote, I realized how systematic her campaign had been. She wasn't just trying to steal David's money, she was trying to destroy my credibility, my career, my relationships, and my reputation as a future mother. But the worst attack came on Friday morning. I woke up to find that someone had spray painted Lola AR across my front door in red letters. Underneath, in smaller text, someone had written, "David's blood is on your hands." I stood on my front porch in my pajamas, staring at this vicious graffiti, and finally understood that Margaret Richardson wasn't just greedy or cruel. She was dangerous. And she wouldn't stop until she'd either destroyed me completely or taken everything I had left of David. I called the police to report the vandalism, then called Sarah Martinez. This ends now, I told her. I don't care what it costs or what it takes. File every motion, trigger every audit, expose every crime. I'm done being the victim. Are you sure, Emma? Once we start this war, there's no going back. I looked at the hate spray painted on my door, thought about the lies being spread about my mental health, and felt my baby kick inside me, David's daughter, who deserved to grow up knowing the truth about her father's love, I'm sure. Let's destroy her. The contractions started at 3 a.m. on a cold December morning, exactly 2 weeks before my due date. I'd been having false labor pains for days, so at first I tried to ignore them and go back to sleep. But these were different, stronger, more regular, and accompanied by a deep pressure that told me this was the real thing. I lay in bed for almost an hour, timing the contractions on my phone app and trying not to panic. David should have been here, helping me through this, timing contractions, with me loading the hospital bag into the car. Instead, I was alone, 7 months after losing my husband, about to bring our daughter into a world where her own grandmother had spray-painted hate across our front door by 4 a.m. The contractions were coming every 5 minutes. I called my doctor's emergency line, and the on-call physician told me to head to the hospital. As I gathered my things, I realized I had no one to call. My sister was in California, My friends from work lived too far away, and the Richardson family had made it clear I was persona non grata. Then I remembered Lisa. I hesitated before calling. It was so early, and I didn't want to drag her into more family drama. But when she answered on the second ring, her voice was immediately alert. Emma, what's wrong? The baby's coming. I'm heading to the hospital, and I don't have anyone else to call. I'm on my way. Don't you dare have that baby without me. There. The drive to Northwestern Memorial was surreal. Chicago was still dark and quiet, with only a few early commuters on the roads. I had to pull over twice when contractions hit, gripping the steering wheel and breathing through the pain. While thinking about how different this should have been, David and I had practiced the drive to the hospital multiple times, joking about him speeding through traffic while I yelled at him to slow down. Instead, I was driving myself to give birth to our daughter alone. The hospital staff was efficient and kind, getting me checked in and settled into a labor and delivery room quickly. Dr. Martinez arrived within an hour, along with a team of nurses who made me feel safe and cared for despite the circumstances. How are you feeling, Emma? Dr. Martinez asked, checking my chart, both physically and emotionally. Scared, I admitted. This isn't how I imagine having my first baby. I know, honey. But you're strong, and your baby is going to be beautiful. We're going to take good care of both of you. Lisa burst through the door just as my water broke. Looking frazzled and carrying what appeared to be half the hospital gift shop, I didn't know what you'd need, she said breathlessly, dumping an armload of flowers, magazines, and snacks onto the visitor's chair. How are you doing? How long have you been in labor? Is there anything I can do? Having her there made all the difference. She held my hand through contractions, helped me walk the halls when the doctor said movement might speed things along, and kept up a steady stream of encouraging chatter that distracted me from both the pain and the sadness of David's absence. He should be here, I said during a particularly difficult contraction around noon. David should be here to meet his daughter. He is here, Lisa said firmly. Maybe not the way you planned, but he's here. And Emma, he would be so proud of you. Right now, you've been through hell these past months, and you're still here, still fighting for this baby. That's exactly the kind of mother he'd want for his child. The labor progressed quickly after that. By 2 p.m., I was ready to push, and by 2:47 p.m., Grace Sophia Richardson entered the world with a powerful cry that seemed to announce her intention. To be her dot, she was perfect. 7 pounds, 2 ounces of absolute perfection, with David's dark hair and what the nurses insisted were my eyes, though all I could see was miracle. When they placed her on my chest, still warm and slippery from birth, I felt a completeness I hadn't experienced since David's death. Hello, baby girl, I whispered, crying happy tears for the first time in months. Daddy and I have been waiting so long to meet you. Grace looked up at me with those unfocused newborn eyes, and I swear she smiled. The nurses said it was just gas, but I knew better. She was saying hello to the mama who'd fought so hard to protect her before she was even born. Lisa was crying too, taking pictures with my phone and calling Grace the most beautiful baby in the entire hospital, which made the nurses laugh and agree enthusiastically. What's her full name for the birth certificate? The registrar asked a few hours later. Grace Sophia Richardson, I said without hesitation. Margaret might hate me, but this baby was David's daughter, and she deserved to carry her father's name. With pride, the next 2 days in the hospital were a peaceful bubble. Grace was an easy baby, nursing well and sleeping in long stretches that allowed me to recover from the delivery. Lisa stayed with me both nights, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair and helping with diaper changes and late-night feedings. You're a natural at this, she said, watching me burp Grace after a 3 a.m. feeding. David would be amazed at how good you are with her. I wish you could see her, I said, studying Grace's tiny features in the dim hospital lighting. I wish she could hold her and tell her how much she loves her. She know. You'll make sure she knows. But our peaceful bubble burst on my second day when the nurse mentioned that there had been phone calls asking about my condition and the baby. Phone calls from whom? Someone claiming to be the baby's grandmother. She was very insistent about getting information, but we can't release patient information without your written consent. She seemed upset about that. My stomach dropped. Margaret knew Grace had been born, which meant she'd probably been calling the hospital regularly, fishing for information. I wondered what story she was planning to tell about David's daughter. I was proven right that evening when Lisa came back from getting coffee in the cafeteria, her face grim. Emma, I ran into my cousin Michael in the lobby. He's Margaret's son, David's brother. What did he say? He congratulated me on becoming a great aunt, but then he said something weird. He said he hoped you'd be reasonable about visitation rights and that the family was prepared to do what's necessary to ensure the baby has proper influences in her life. What does that mean? I think it means Margaret is planning to go after custody or visitation rights to Grace. I looked down at my sleeping daughter, so tiny and vulnerable in my arms, and felt a fierce protectiveness rise up in me like a tidal wave. Margaret had tried to destroy me, but I'd be damned if I'd let her get her claws into my child. Over my dead body, I said quietly, "This baby is mine and David's. No one else has any rights to her." Emma, I need to tell you something else. Michael mentioned that the family has been meeting with lawyers about the situation. I think they're planning something big. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Congratulations on the birth of our granddaughter. We look forward to meeting her soon and discussing arrangements for her welfare. The Richardson family. I showed the text to Lisa, who read it with growing anger. Discussing arrangements for her welfare? That sounds like a threat. It is a threat, I said, holding Grace closer. They're telling me they're going to try to take her away from me. I immediately called Sarah Martinez, even though it was after hours. When I read her the text, she was quiet for a long moment. Emma, I want you to forward that text to me immediately, and I want you to document every interaction you have with any member of the Richardson family from now on. Don't respond to that text. Don't take any calls from them, and don't let them into your hospital room if they show up. Can they really try to get custody of Grace? They can try, but they won't succeed. You're Grace's mother, you're mentally and financially stable, and you have no history of abuse or neglect. But Emma, we need to accelerate our timeline. I'm filing all our motions first thing Monday morning. We're not going to let them use Grace as a weapon against you. That night, I held my daughter and made her a promise that I knew David would have approved of. I'm going to protect you, baby girl, I whispered as she slept peacefully in my arms. Your daddy left us everything we need to fight for our family, and I'm going to make sure you grow up safe and loved and free from their poison. You're going to know exactly how much your father loved you, and you're going to be proud of the Richardson name because of him, not them. Grace stirred in her sleep, her tiny hand curling around my finger, and I knew that David was somehow there, with us, giving me the strength I'd need for the battles ahead. The war for our daughter's future was about to begin, but looking at Grace's perfect face, I knew I'd already won the most important battle. I was her mother, and nothing the Richardson family could do would ever change that. Grace was only 6 days old when the custody petition arrived. I was at home, finally settled into some semblance of a routine with my daughter, when the process server knocked on my door. Grace had been fussy all morning, and I was exhausted from round-the-clock feedings, so I answered the door in my pajamas with spit up on my shoulder. Emma Richardson? Yes. You're being served. Court date is in 3 weeks. I stared at the thick manila envelope in my hands, Grace crying in the background, and felt my world tilt sideways again. The legal language was dense and intimidating, but the core message was clear. Margaret and Robert Richardson were petitioning for emergency custody of Grace Sophia Richardson, claiming that I was an unfit mother due to mental instability, financial irresponsibility, and inability to provide a stable home environment. The petition painted a devastating picture of me as a grieving widow who'd become unstable and potentially dangerous to my own child. It cited my history of making false accusations against family members, my demonstrated inability to maintain employment, and my isolation from support systems due to paranoid behavior. Every lie Margaret had been spreading for months was now part of an official court document, but the most chilling part was a section titled Emergency Concerns for Child Welfare, which claimed that I had been observed talking to myself and showing signs of postpartum depression, and that there were credible reports of the mother expressing thoughts of self-harm. I read that section 3 times before it sank in. Margaret wasn't just trying to take Grace away from me, she was trying to make it look like I was suicidal. I called Sarah Martinez immediately, but she was in court. Her secretary promised to have her call me back as soon as possible, but that left me alone with Grace and a legal document that made me sound like an unhinged woman who posed a danger to my own child. Grace must have sensed my distress because her crying intensified. I picked her up, walking her around the living room while trying to process what I'd just read. How could anyone believe I was unstable? I'd been grieving, yes, and stressed by Margaret's harassment, but I was perfectly capable of caring for my daughter. Then I started thinking about all the seeds Margaret had been planting. The calls to my school questioning my mental state. The conversations with neighbors about my financial troubles. The fake medical records Lisa had mentioned. Margaret hadn't been randomly cruel. She'd been building a case. My phone rang, and I grabbed it hoping it was Sarah, but the number was unfamiliar. Mrs. Richardson? This is Dr. Patricia Williams from Child Protective Services. We received a petition requesting a welfare check on your newborn daughter. I'd like to schedule a time to visit your home and assess the situation. My legs gave out and I sank onto the couch, still holding Grace. A welfare check? It's routine when custody concerns are raised about a newborn. I'm not making any judgments. I just need to see your living situation and have a conversation with you about your support systems and mental health resources. Dr. Williams, I need you to know that there's a family dispute going on. My mother-in-law has been harassing me since my husband died, and I believe this petition is part of that harassment. I understand there are family complications, Mrs. Richardson. That's exactly why we need to do an independent assessment. Can you meet with me tomorrow afternoon? After hanging up, I sat holding Grace and crying angry tears. Margaret was using the system against me, weaponizing government agencies and legal processes to terrorize a new mother. But what terrified me most was how effective her strategy was. Even though I knew I was a good mother, even though I had documentation of her lies and crimes, I was suddenly on the defensive, having to prove my fitness as a parent. Sarah called back within an hour, and her fury was immediate and intense. This is one of the most vicious custody petitions I've ever seen, she said after I'd read her the key sections. Emma, they're not just trying to get custody, they're trying to destroy your reputation so thoroughly that even if they lose, the damage to your credibility will be permanent. Can they win? Not if I have anything to say about it. But we need to be strategic. Tomorrow's CPS visit is crucial. You need to be prepared for every question they might ask, and we need to have our counter evidence ready. That evening, Lisa came over to help me prepare for the CPS visit and to review the custody petition. When she read the section about my alleged mental instability, she was livid. This is complete fiction. Emma, you've been grieving and stressed, but you've never shown any signs of being unstable or dangerous. And anyone who's seen you with Grace can see that you're a wonderful mother. But what if Dr. Williams believes them? What if she sees a tired new mother who's been crying and decides there's cause for concern? Then we make sure she sees the truth. Lisa pulled out her phone. I'm calling everyone who's been around you since Grace was born. Your doctors, the hospital nurses, me, even Mrs. Henderson from down the street who helped you with groceries. Last week, we're going to get character references that prove you're a stable, loving mother. The next afternoon, Dr. Williams arrived at exactly 2 p.m. She was a middle-aged African-American woman with kind eyes, but a professional demeanor that gave nothing away. I'd cleaned the house meticulously, organized all of Grace's supplies, and, dressed in my most presentable outfit that still fit my postpartum body, Mrs. Richardson, thank you for meeting with me. This is a beautiful home, she said, looking around the living room that David and I had decorated together. Thank you. My husband and I bought it when we found out I was pregnant. We wanted Grace to have a stable, loving environment. Dr. Williams spent an hour going through a detailed questionnaire about my mental health, support systems, financial situation, and daily routine with Grace. She watched me change Grace's diaper, observed a feeding, and asked specific questions about everything from my sleep schedule to my plans for returning to work. Mrs. Richardson, I have to ask about the allegations in the custody petition. Have you been experiencing symptoms of depression or anxiety since your husband's death? I've been grieving, Dr. Williams. That's normal when you lose your husband. But I've never been diagnosed with any mental health condition, and I've certainly never expressed thoughts of self-harm. What about the claims that you've been making false accusations against family members? This was my chance to tell the truth. I pulled out copies of all the documentation Sarah and I had gathered, the evidence of Margaret's embezzlement, the harassment reports, the timeline of her escalating attacks against me. Dr. Williams, my mother-in-law has been systematically harassing me since my husband's death as part of an attempt to steal his inheritance. Everything I've accused her of is documented fact. Dr. Williams reviewed the documents carefully, her expression growing more serious with each page. This is quite extensive. Have you filed criminal charges? My attorney is handling that. But Dr. Williams, I need you to understand this custody petition isn't about Grace's welfare. It's about Margaret Richardson trying to silence me before I expose her crimes. I see. Dr. Williams made notes in her file. Mrs. Richardson, based on my observation today, I see no evidence of any factors that would make you an unfit mother. Your home is clean and baby appropriate. You're clearly bonded with your daughter, and you seem to be managing the challenges of new motherhood well, despite difficult circumstances. Relief flooded through me. So you'll recommend that Grace stay with me? I'll be filing a report that finds no cause for concern about your daughter's welfare. However, Mrs. Richardson, I do want to suggest that you consider counseling, not because you're unstable, but because you're dealing with grief, legal stress, and new motherhood simultaneously. A therapist could help you manage that stress and might also provide documentation of your mental stability that could be useful in court. After Dr. Williams left, I held Grace close and felt the first spark of real hope I'd had since receiving the custody petition. We're going to be okay, baby girl, I whispered. Daddy made sure we had everything we needed to fight for our family, and we're going to win. That evening, Sarah called with an update that made my hope grow stronger. Emma, I've reviewed the custody petition with our investigator, and we found some very interesting discrepancies. Several of the witnesses cited in the petition either don't exist or have never met you. Margaret has been fabricating testimony. What does that mean? It means we're not just going to defeat this custody challenge, we're going to destroy her credibility so completely that she'll never be able to threaten you again. And Emma, we're going to make sure she pays for every day of hell she's put you through. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah and I worked tirelessly to build an airtight case against Margaret's custody petition. What started as a defensive strategy quickly became an offensive campaign as we uncovered just how deep Margaret's deception ran at our private investigator, a sharp woman named Detective Reynolds, who'd retired from the Chicago PD, found that 3 of the 5 witnesses Margaret had cited in her petition were completely fabricated. The addresses listed for these supposed neighbors who'd observed my erratic behavior led to an empty lot, a commercial building, and a house that had been abandoned for 2 years. This level of fraud in a legal document is serious, Sarah explained. During one of our strategy sessions, it's not just perjury, it's conspiracy to deprive you of your parental rights through fraudulent means. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the psychiatrist who Margaret claimed had treated me for severe postpartum depression and suicidal ideation, called Sarah's office directly. "I've never treated anyone named Emma Richardson," Dr. Walsh told Sarah. "In fact, I don't even practice postpartum psychiatry. I specialize in geriatric mental health. Someone used my name and credentials without permission, which is identity theft." The medical records Margaret had been showing people were forgeries, created using a real doctor's information but completely fabricated patient details. When Sarah cross-referenced the other medical professionals cited in the petition, we found similar patterns of fraud. Meanwhile, I was building my own evidence of being a competent, loving mother. My pediatrician, Dr. Kim, provided a glowing report about Grace's health and development, noting that I was attentive, knowledgeable, and clearly devoted to my daughter's well-being. The hospital nurses who'd cared for us during Grace's birth wrote statements describing me as calm, responsible, and natural with her baby. Even Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor who'd been initially swayed by Margaret's lies, came forward with an apology and an offer to testify on my behalf. "I feel terrible about believing those things Margaret told me," she said when she stopped by with a casserole. "But watching you with Grace these past weeks, seeing how you care for her, anyone can see you're a wonderful mother." The most powerful evidence, however, came from the hospital's security footage. Sarah had requested recordings from the parking garage during the days I was in labor and recovery, hoping to document Margaret's presence as evidence of harassment. What we found was far more revealing. The footage showed Margaret in the hospital parking garage on the day Grace was born, not visiting or bringing flowers like a concerned grandmother, but sitting in her car for hours, making phone calls and taking notes. The timestamps showed she'd been there from early morning until late evening, systematically gathering information about my condition and Grace's birth details. "She was conducting surveillance," Detective Reynolds explained. "She wasn't there. Out of concern for you or the baby, she was gathering intelligence for her custody case." But the breakthrough came when Reynolds tracked down Margaret's phone records for the week Grace was born. The records showed dozens of calls to numbers associated with private investigators, family law attorneys, and what appeared to be document forgers. "Your mother-in-law spent over $50,000 in the first week after Grace's birth preparing this custody case," Reynolds reported. "The money came from accounts that our forensic accountant has identified as containing embezzled funds from Richardson. Family businesses." Sarah's eyes lit up when she heard this. "She's using stolen money to fund her attack on you. That's not just embezzlement, it's conspiracy and fraud in furtherance of a scheme to deprive you of custody of your child." As we build our case, I also followed Dr. Williams's suggestion and started seeing a therapist. Dr. Linda Chen, no relation to James Chen, was warm and practical, helping me process my grief while also providing the kind of professional documentation that would be useful in court. "Emma, you're dealing with an extraordinary level of stress and trauma," Dr. Chen told me during our 3rd session. "The fact that you're functioning as well as you are, caring for Grace so beautifully while fighting this legal battle, actually demonstrates remarkable emotional stability." "Sometimes I feel like I'm going crazy," I admitted. Margaret's lies are so detailed, so convincing. Sometimes I wonder if I really am the person she's describing. That's a normal response to gaslighting and psychological abuse, Dr. Chen explained. Margaret has been systematically undermining your sense of reality to make you doubt yourself. But Emma, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I can tell you with complete confidence, you are not unstable. You are not a danger to your child, and you are not the villain in this story. Dr. Chun's professional assessment became part of our legal file, providing expert testimony that directly contradicted every claim in Margaret's petition. 3 days before the custody hearing, Sarah called me with news that changed everything. Emma, Detective Reynolds has uncovered something huge. Margaret's embezzlement goes much deeper than we thought. She hasn't just stolen from the family business, she's been running a sophisticated money laundering operation through fake charities and shell companies. How much money are we talking about? Over $5 million. And get this, some of the money she's using to fund her legal attack on you was originally meant for children's charities. She's literally stealing from children to try to take your child away from you. I felt sick. How could someone do that? Because she's desperate. Our investigation has shown that Margaret has gambling debts of over $3 million. She owes money to some very dangerous people, and she's been using increasingly desperate measures to stay ahead of her creditors. So this whole thing, David's death, the harassment, the custody case, it's all about money. It's all about money she stole, and now she needs David's inheritance to cover her crimes. But Emma, we have something even better than evidence of her embezzlement. What? We have recordings. Detective Reynolds found that Margaret has been secretly recording her conversations with family members, probably for blackmail purposes. But in those recordings, she admits to fabricating evidence against you and discusses her plans to eliminate the problem of your custody of Grace. My heart stopped. Eliminate the problem? She doesn't mean physical harm, Sarah said quickly. She means legal elimination, taking Grace away from you permanently and possibly having you declared mentally incompetent so you can't contest David's will. That evening, as I fed Grace her bedtime bottle, I thought about all the evidence we'd gathered. Margaret's web of lies was unraveling, revealing a picture of a woman so consumed by greed and desperation that she'd victimize her own son's widow and try to steal his child. Your daddy was right to protect us, I whispered to Grace as she dozed. In my arms. He knew exactly what kind of person his mother really was, and he made sure we'd have everything we needed to stop her. Grace stirred in her sleep, her tiny hand curling around my finger, and I felt David's presence so strongly it was almost like he was sitting beside us. The custody hearing was in 3 days, but I was no longer afraid. We had the truth, we had the evidence, and we had justice on our side. Margaret Richardson was about to learn that stealing from children's charities to fund a custody battle was the biggest mistake of her criminal career. 2 days before the custody hearing, Sarah called me with an idea that was both brilliant and terrifying. Emma, I want you to call Margaret and ask to meet with her. Tell her you're willing to discuss a settlement. Are you insane? Why would? I want to meet with her because we need her to confess on tape. We have evidence of her embezzlement and fraud, but we need her own words admitting to the harassment and the fabricated custody case. If she thinks she's won, if she believes you're desperate enough to negotiate, she might reveal more than she intends to. My stomach churned at the thought of facing Margaret alone. What if she suspects something? What if she tries to hurt me? You'll meet in a public place, and Detective Reynolds will be nearby for security. Emma, I know this is asking a lot, but Margaret's lawyers are good. They're going to argue that all our evidence is circumstantial, that grief has made you paranoid, that you're seeing conspiracies where none exist. But if we have her own voice admitting to what she's done, it would end this completely. It would not only end the custody case, it would give us criminal evidence that could put her in prison. That night, I practiced the conversation with Lisa, who played Margaret. While I tried to stay calm and ask the right questions, it was harder than I'd expected. Even pretending to be submissive to Margaret, pretending to believe her lies about David, made me feel sick. Remember, Lisa coached me, she thinks she's winning. She thinks you're broken down and ready to give up. Use that. Let her gloat. Let her think she's gotten away with everything. The next morning, I called Margaret. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial the number. Well, Margaret's voice was sickeningly sweet when she realized it was me. I was wondering when you'd finally come to your senses. Margaret, I think we need to talk. About Grace, about the custody case. I can't fight this anymore. Of course you can't, dear. You never had a chance. But I'm glad you're finally being realistic about the situation. Could we meet somewhere? I'd like to discuss ... odd arrangements. I think that's very wise, Emma. Why don't we meet at Cafe Luna downtown? Say 2 p.m. We can have a civilized conversation about what's best for Grace. I spent the morning with Detective Reynolds, getting fitted with a tiny recording device and going over the questions Sarah wanted me to ask. The device was so small it was hidden inside a button on my sweater, completely invisible but powerful, enough to pick up conversation clearly. Remember, we need her to admit specific things, Detective Reynolds coached me. We need her to admit to fabricating evidence, to harassing you, and ideally to mention the embezzlement. Don't be obvious about leading her to these topics, but if she starts bragging about how clever she's been, encourage her to keep talking. Caf Luna was busy during the lunch rush, which provided perfect cover. I arrived early and chose a corner table where Reynolds could sit nearby with a clear view of our conversation. When Margaret walked in, looking perfectly put together in an expensive suit, I had to grip my coffee cup to keep my hands from shaking. Emma, you look terrible, Margaret said as she sat down, not bothering to hide her satisfaction. Motherhood certainly hasn't agreed with you. I've been stressed about the custody case, I said quietly. I can't afford to fight you legally, and I'm worried about Grace, as you should be. That baby deserves stability, not a mother who's clearly struggling with mental health issues. I bit my tongue to keep from responding angrily. Margaret, what do you want? What would it take for you to withdraw the custody petition? Margaret smiled, and for the first time I saw the predator underneath her elegant exterior. Well, first you need to acknowledge that David's death was caused by the stress of supporting you and the pregnancy. A public acknowledgement that your demands contributed to his accident. I can't do that. It's not true, isn't it? David was working late that night because he needed the money. He was under tremendous pressure to provide for a wife who was never satisfied with what she had. I forced myself to look down, to appear defeated. Maybe you're right. Maybe I did ask for too much. Of course I'm right. I know my son better than anyone. And I know you were bleeding him dry financially and emotionally. Margaret was warming up now, clearly enjoying my apparent submission. The house, the expensive nursery furniture, all those doctor's appointments. David told me how demanding you'd become. He said that. He confided in me about everything, Emma. He was having second thoughts about the marriage, about whether he was ready for a child. If he hadn't died in that accident, I think he would have asked for a divorce. I knew she was lying. David had never expressed anything but joy about our marriage and the pregnancy, but hearing her poison his memory made it hard to stay in character. So, what do you want from me? I asked. First, a public statement taking responsibility for David's death. Second, you'll sign over full custody of Grace to Robert and me. We'll allow you supervised visitation, of course, but the child needs to be raised by people who can provide stability. And if I don't agree, Margaret's smile turned vicious. Oh, Emma, you have no idea what I'm capable of. The custody case is just the beginning. I have medical records proving you're mentally unstable, I have witness statements about your erratic behavior. I have evidence of your inability to properly care for a child. You have all that. I have whatever I need to have. Margaret leaned forward, clearly enjoying herself. You seem to think this is some kind of fair fight, but you're completely outmatched. I've been planning this since the day David died. Planning what? Planning to erase you from our family completely. David made a mistake marrying you, and I'm correcting that mistake. When I'm done, it will be like you never existed. Grace will grow up knowing that her real family, her blood family, saved her from an unstable mother who couldn't provide for her. I forced myself to keep looking defeated while my heart pounded with excitement. She was confessing to everything. But the house is in my name too. David's will. David's will is meaningless when the beneficiary is declared mentally incompetent. And as for the house, well, let's just say that property ownership can be very complicated when proper procedures aren't followed. What do you mean? Margaret laughed, actually laughed. Oh, Emma, you really are naive, aren't you? Those documents you think prove your ownership? Let's just say that paperwork can be edited ... when necessary. David's personal attorney understood that family loyalty was more important than technical legalities. She was admitting to document fraud, to bribing or threatening James Chun, to planning to have me declared incompetent. I couldn't believe she was saying all of this out loud. Margaret, how can you do this? I'm the mother of your grandchild. You're the woman who killed my son. Margaret's voice turned cold and vicious. You and that mistake you're carrying are the reason David is dead. I told you that at the funeral, and it's still true. Every time I look at that baby, I see the burden that cost my son his life. Grace isn't a burden. Grace is a Richardson, and she'll be raised by Richardsons. You're just the vessel who carried her, nothing more. And once I have custody, once I've proven you're unfit, you'll be lucky if I allow you to see her once a month. I had to dig my nails into my palms to keep from screaming at her. She was talking about my daughter like she was property to be claimed, about me like I was a surrogate who'd outlived her usefulness. What if I fight this? What if I don't agree to your terms? Margaret's smile was absolutely chilling. Then I'll destroy you completely. I have resources you can't imagine, Emma. I have connections, influence, money. I can make sure you never work as a teacher again. I can make sure no one in the city believes a word you say. I can make your life so miserable that you'll beg me to take Grace off your hands. You'd really do all that? I've already started. Those calls to your school, the conversations with your neighbors, the medical records proving your instability, that was all just the opening move. If you force me to play hardball, you'll discover that I'm very, very good at destroying people who stand in my way. She stood up, smoothing her skirt with complete confidence. Think about what I've said, Emma. You have until tomorrow morning to decide. Accept my terms voluntarily, or I'll take Grace away from you and make sure you're left with nothing but the memory of how foolish you were to fight me. After she left, I sat in that cafe for 10 minutes, shaking with rage and relief. I had everything: her admission of fraud, her confession to harassment, her threats about destroying my life, and most importantly, her clear statement that she'd been planning to erase me from the family since David's death. When I met Sarah and Detective Reynolds back at the law office to review the recording, Sarah was practically gleeful. Emma, this is prosecutorial gold. She confessed to conspiracy, fraud, harassment, and attempted bribery of a court officer. But more than that, she revealed her entire plan to steal Grace and destroy your life. What happens now? Now we go to court tomorrow and end this nightmare forever. Margaret Richardson has no idea that she just sealed her own fate. The morning of the custody hearing, I woke up feeling calm for the first time in months. Grace had slept through the night as if she somehow knew that today was important, and I had time for a proper breakfast and shower before Lisa arrived to watch her during the proceedings. You look different today, Lisa observed as she held Grace. Stronger. I feel different. For months, I've been playing defense, trying to prove I'm not the terrible person Margaret claims I am. Today, I get to go on offense. Sarah had coached me extensively on what to expect. The judge will hear their custody petition first, then we'll present our response. But Emma, what we're really doing today is exposing Margaret's entire criminal enterprise. By the time we're done, she won't just lose the custody case, she'll be facing federal charges. The courthouse was intimidating, all marble columns and formal proceedings, but I felt David's presence with me as I walked into the family court building. Margaret was already there with her legal team, 3 expensive-looking attorneys in perfect suits who radiated confidence and entitlement. Margaret herself looked every inch the concerned grandmother in a navy blue dress and pearls. Her silver hair perfectly styled. When she saw me, she gave me that cold smile I learned to hate. "Ready to do the right thing, Emma?" She asked loud enough for her lawyers to hear. It's not too late to avoid putting Grace through the trauma of a court battle. I met her gaze steadily. I'm ready to make sure Grace knows the truth about her family. The hearing began with Margaret's attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Westfield, presenting their case. She painted a devastating picture of me as an unstable widow whose grief had made her paranoid and potentially dangerous to my own child. Your Honor, Mrs. Emma Richardson has shown a pattern of erratic behavior since her husband's death, Westfield argued. She has made wild, unfounded accusations against her late husband's family, claiming they're involved in some kind of conspiracy against her. She has isolated herself from support systems, refused family assistance, and according to medical records, has been diagnosed with severe postpartum depression with suicidal ideation. Westfield presented what looked like an impressive collection of evidence medical records. Witness statements, photographs of my deteriorated home condition, and documentation of my alleged mental health crises. The Richardson family is not seeking to harm Mrs. Emma Richardson, Westfield continued. They are simply concerned about the welfare of their granddaughter. Mr. and Mrs. Robert Richardson are financially stable, emotionally supportive, and have extensive experience raising children. They can provide Grace with the stability that her mother, sadly, cannot currently offer. Judge Morrison, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, listened carefully, occasionally asking questions about specific claims. When Westfield finished, she turned to Sarah. Ms. Martinez, how does your client respond to these allegations? Sarah stood, and I could see the controlled anger in her posture. Your Honor, my client's response is simple. Nearly everything the petitioners have claimed is a complete fabrication. Mrs. Emma Richardson is not mentally unstable. She has not been diagnosed with any psychiatric condition, and she is certainly not a danger to her child. What we have here is not a custody case, it's a criminal conspiracy. Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose. That's a serious allegation, Counselor. It is, Your Honor, and I have serious evidence to support it. Sarah began methodically dismantling Margaret's case. She showed that 3 of the 5 witnesses cited in the custody petition didn't exist. She presented testimony from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the psychiatrist whose identity had been stolen to create fake medical records. She played portions of hospital security footage showing Margaret conducting surveillance rather than offering family support. Your Honor, Mrs. Margaret Richardson has spent over $50,000 in the past month fabricating evidence against my client. She has committed identity theft, document fraud, and perjury in the service of this custody petition. But the bombshell came when Sarah played the recording from our cafe meeting. Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence of Mrs. Margaret Richardson's own words, recorded yesterday when she believed my client was ready to surrender custody. The courtroom fell completely silent as Margaret's voice filled the room coldly, discussing her plans to erase me from the family. Her admission of fabricating evidence, and her chilling threats about what she'd do if I continued to resist. I watched Margaret's face as her own words played back, saw the color drain from her cheeks and the panic in her eyes. Her attorneys looked stunned, frantically whispering among themselves. Furthermore, Your Honor, Sarah continued, our investigation has revealed that Mrs. Margaret Richardson is currently under federal investigation for embezzling over $5 million from Richardson family businesses and associated children's charities. The money she used to fund this custody case was stolen from charitable organizations meant to help disadvantaged children. Judge Morrison looked from Sarah to Margaret's legal team. Is this true? Is your client under federal investigation? Patricia Westfield stood slowly, clearly rattled. Your Honor, we were not aware of any federal investigation. If these allegations are accurate, we would need time to review our client's situation. Your Honor, Sarah pressed on, I have documentation from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit confirming that Mrs. Margaret Richardson is the subject of an ongoing investigation. I also have testimony from multiple witnesses establishing a pattern of harassment, intimidation, and financial fraud directed at my client since her husband's death. The judge called for a recess, during which I watched Margaret huddled with her attorneys in increasingly heated conversation. Patricia Westfield looked like she wanted to be anywhere else, while Margaret's face cycled between fury and panic as the full scope of her exposure became clear. When court resumed, Judge Morrison's expression was stern. I have reviewed the evidence presented by both sides, and I am deeply troubled by what I've heard. Ms. Westfield, does your client wish to withdraw the custody petition? Patricia Westfield stood reluctantly. Your Honor, in light of the new information presented, we request time to reassess our client's position. I'm afraid that's not an option, Judge Morrison replied firmly. Based on the evidence of fraud and perjury in the original petition, I am not only denying the custody request, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. Margaret shot to her feet. This is ridiculous. That woman has been making false accusations against my family for months. She's unstable. Mrs. Richardson, you will sit down and remain silent. Judge Morrison's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. I have just listened to a recording of you admitting to fabricating evidence and threatening to destroy a new mother's life. Your credibility in this courtroom is zero. The judge turned to me with a much gentler expression. Mrs. Emma Richardson, based on the evidence presented, including the glowing reports from Child Protective Services, your pediatrician, and multiple character witnesses, I find no cause whatsoever to question your fitness as a mother. The custody petition is denied in its entirety. Relief flooded through me so powerfully, I almost started crying right there in the courtroom. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, I am issuing an immediate restraining order, prohibiting any member of the Richardson family from contacting you or your daughter except through legal counsel. Any violation of this order will result in immediate arrest. Sarah stood again. Your Honor, we have additional motions we'd like to file regarding my client's inheritance rights and the harassment she's endured. File whatever motions you deem appropriate, Ms. Martinez and Mrs. Emma Richardson. The judge looked directly at me. I want you to know that what you've endured is unconscionable. No mother should have to fight for her child against fabricated evidence and criminal conspiracy. I hope you find peace and justice. As we left the courtroom, Margaret tried one last desperate attack. She broke away from her attorneys and approached me in the hallway, her elegant composure finally cracking completely. This isn't over, she hissed. You think you've won something, but I will never stop fighting you. That baby belongs with her. Real family. Ma'am, step away from my client immediately, Sarah intervened, positioning herself between Margaret and me. You are in violation of a restraining order that was issued less than 5 minutes ago. Two court security officers were already moving toward us, and Margaret seemed to realize how far she'd fallen. The elegant, powerful woman who terrorized me for months now looked desperate and unhinged. "You killed my son," she said, her voice breaking. "You and that baby killed David, and I'll never forgive you for that." "No, Margaret," I said quietly, finding strength I didn't know I had. "Your greed killed David. Your crimes and your lies killed any chance you had of knowing your granddaughter. David would be ashamed of what you've become." The security officers escorted Margaret away while her attorneys looked on in professional embarrassment. Patricia Westfield approached Sarah with obvious reluctance. "Ms. Martinez, our firm will be withdrawing from representation of Mrs. Richardson effective immediately. We were not aware of the criminal allegations, and we cannot continue to represent someone who may have committed fraud in furtherance of this case." As we walked out of the courthouse, Sarah was practically beaming. "Emma, that was better than I could have hoped for." Margaret didn't just lose the custody case, she exposed herself so completely that she'd be facing criminal charges within days. What happens now? Now we go on the offensive. We file a civil lawsuit for harassment, emotional distress, and interference with your inheritance. We seek damages for every day of hell she put you through. And we make sure that Grace's college fund is well established with the money Margaret is going to pay in restitution. That evening, I sat in Grace's nursery, our nursery, in our house, that no one could ever take away from us, and told my daughter about her daddy. "Your father was a good man who loved us so much he protected us even after he died," I whispered as she dozed in my arms. "He made sure we'd always be safe, always be together, and always know the truth about his love." Grace stirred and seemed to smile in her sleep, and I felt David's presence so strongly, it was almost like he was there with us. Finally seeing his family safe and whole, the counterattack was just beginning, but the most important battle was already won. Grace was mine, our home was secure, and Margaret Richardson was about to learn that some victories come at a very steep price. 3 days after the custody hearing, Sarah called with news that would change everything. "Emma, the FBI Financial Crimes Unit wants to meet with you. Margaret's embezzlement case has exploded into something much bigger than we initially thought. Special Agent Jennifer Park met us at Sarah's office, carrying thick folders and looking like someone who'd been working 18-hour days. She was younger than I'd expected for a federal agent, but her intensity was immediately apparent. "Mrs. Richardson, thank you for agreeing to meet with us. Your husband's death and your subsequent investigation into his family's financial dealings have uncovered what appears to be a massive financial fraud operation." She spread documents across Sarah's conference table, and I saw bank statements, wire transfer records, and corporate filings that meant nothing to me but clearly told a story to Agent Park. "Margaret Richardson hasn't just been embezzling from family businesses," Agent Park explained. "She's been running what we call a charity fraud scheme for over 8 years. She establishes fake charitable organizations, solicits donations from wealthy Chicago families, then diverts the money into personal accounts." "How much money are we talking about?" Sarah asked. "So far, we've identified approximately $12 million in fraudulent transactions. The money was supposed to go to children's hospitals, cancer research, and educational programs for disadvantaged youth. Instead, it went to cover Margaret's gambling debts and fund her luxury lifestyle." I felt sick. $12 million meant for children. The children's hospital alone lost over $3 million in donations that never reached them. "But Mrs. Richardson, here's where your situation becomes crucial to our investigation." Agent Park pulled out a document I recognized David's private investigator's report. "Your husband discovered irregularities in the family business accounts about 2 months before his death. He hired a private investigator, and that investigation inadvertently uncovered the broader fraud scheme. We believe Margaret realized David was getting close to exposing her crimes." My blood ran cold. Are you saying Margaret might have had something to do with David's death? We have no evidence that his death was anything other than a tragic accident caused by a drunk driver, Agent Park said quickly. But we do have evidence that Margaret accelerated her criminal activities after David's death, possibly because she knew he'd been investigating her. Sarah leaned forward. What kind of evidence? Bank records show that Margaret moved over $2 million through shell companies in the weeks immediately following David's funeral. She also made large payments to several individuals who appear to be document forgers and private investigators. Agent Park pulled out copies of bank statements with highlighted transactions. This payment of $75,000 went to a company that specializes in creating false identity documents. This $50,000 payment went to a firm known for fabricating medical records. And this $25,000 payment went to someone we believe helped create the false witness statements in her custody petition against you. So she used stolen charity money to fund her attack on Emma? Sarah asked. Exactly. And that makes this not just embezzlement and fraud, but also racketeering using criminal proceeds to fund additional criminal activities. I stared at the evidence spread across the table, trying to process the scope of Margaret's crimes. Agent Park, what does this mean for Grace and me? It means that when Margaret is convicted, and with this evidence, conviction is almost certain, you'll be entitled to significant restitution. The government will seize all her assets and use them to compensate victims of her fraud scheme. But more importantly, Sarah added, it means that Margaret Richardson's ability to threaten you is completely destroyed. She's going to prison. For a very long time, Agent Park nodded. Mrs. Richardson, we estimate she faced federal charges carrying a potential sentence of 15 to 20 years. She's 62 years old. This is essentially a life sentence. When will she be arrested? We're executing search warrants tomorrow morning. But I need to warn you, when Margaret realizes the full scope of our investigation, she may become desperate. Desperate people can be dangerous. Sarah immediately arranged for additional security for me and Grace, and Agent Park provided us with direct contact numbers in case Margaret violated the restraining order. That evening, I was feeding Grace when Lissa called, her voice panicked. Emma, something's happening at Aunt Margaret's house. There are FBI trucks everywhere, and neighbors are saying they're carrying out boxes of documents. I turned on the local news and saw footage of federal agents removing evidence from the Richardson family mansion. The reporter was standing in front of the imposing gates, describing an ongoing federal investigation into allegations of charity fraud and embezzlement. Sources close to the investigation indicate that Margaret Richardson, widow of prominent businessman Robert Richardson, is suspected of defrauding multiple charitable organizations over an 8-year period, the reporter announced as I watched. Margaret's world publicly collapsed. I felt no satisfaction, only sadness for the children who'd suffered because of her greed. The money that should have funded cancer treatments and educational programs had instead paid for her designer clothes and gambling addiction. My phone rang again. This time it was Agent Park. Mrs. Richardson, I wanted to let you know that Margaret Richardson has been arrested and charged with federal racketeering, wire fraud, and money laundering. She's being held without bail as a flight risk. What about Robert, David's father? Mr. Richardson appears to have been unaware of his wife's criminal activities. Our investigation suggests she managed to hide her crimes from him as well. He's cooperating fully with our investigation. After hanging up, I looked at Grace, who was sleeping peacefully in her bouncer, completely unaware that her grandmother was now in federal custody. It's over, baby girl, I whispered. The woman who tried to take you away from me is never going to hurt us again. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't completely over. There would be trials, testimony, and the process of rebuilding our lives. But for the first time since David's death, I felt truly safe. The next morning, Sarah called with another update. Emma, the government wants to discuss restitution with you. As a victim of Margaret's harassment and fraud scheme, you're entitled to compensation. But there's more. They've discovered that Margaret forged documents to steal money from David's trust fund after his death. She stole from David's trust over $200,000 that should have gone to you and Grace, but with interest and penalties, she owes you significantly more than that. That afternoon, we met with federal prosecutors who explained that I was considered a primary victim in Margaret's racketeering scheme. The money she'd stolen from David's trust, combined with the costs of fighting her fraudulent custody case and the emotional distress she'd caused, entitled me to substantial restitution from her seized assets. Mrs. Richardson, the prosecutor, explained, when we liquidate Margaret Richardson's assets, her house, cars, jewelry, investments, you'll likely receive over $500,000 in restitution. That money rightfully belongs to you and your daughter. As we left the prosecutor's office, Sarah was smiling broadly. Emma, do you realize what this means? You and Grace are not just safe, you're going to be financially secure for life. David's insurance money, his trust fund, and now this restitution, Grace will never want for anything. That evening, I sat in David's office, looking at the copies of all the documents he'd left to protect us. His private investigator's report, his will, his insurance policies, every piece of evidence that had ultimately brought down Margaret's criminal empire. You knew, didn't you? I said to his photo on the desk. Somehow you knew she'd try to destroy us, and you made sure we'd have everything we needed to fight back. Grace started crying from her crib, and as I went to comfort her, I realized that David's greatest gift wasn't the money or the evidence he'd left us. It was the knowledge that love could be stronger than greed, that truth could overcome lies, and that even from beyond the grave, a father's protection could keep his family safe. 6 months after Margaret's arrest, as summer turned to fall, federal prosecutors began preparing for what they called one of the largest charity fraud cases in Illinois history. I would be a key witness, not just for the embezzlement charges, but for the racketeering counts that included her systematic harassment and fraud directed at me. Grace was crawling now, pulling herself up on furniture and babbling constantly. Sometimes I'd catch her looking toward David's photo on the mantel and gurgling happily as if she recognized her daddy. Those moments made me more determined than ever to see justice done, not just for us, but for all the children whose medical treatments and educational opportunities had been stolen by Margaret's greed. Assistant District Attorney Michael Chen, another Chen, but no relation to Dr. Chen or James Chen, was prosecuting the federal case. He was meticulous and passionate about victims' rights, which made me trust him immediately. Emma, I need you to understand how important your testimony will be, he explained during one of our preparation sessions. Margaret's defense team is going to argue that she was a grieving mother who acted irrationally after losing her son. They'll try to minimize the harassment you endured and claim it was just family drama that got out of hand. But we have the recording of her confessing to fabricating evidence. We do, and it's powerful, but her attorneys are going to argue she was just venting frustration, not actually admitting to crimes. That's why we need you to walk the jury through the systematic nature of her campaign against you. The prosecution team had put together a timeline that was staggering in its detail. Margaret's crimes began 8 years ago with small diversions from charity accounts, escalated into full-scale fraud operations, and culminated in her desperate attempt to steal David's inheritance while destroying my credibility as a mother. Really makes this case extraordinary, Ada Chen explained, is how she used criminal proceeds to fund additional crimes. The money she stole from children's charities literally paid for the private investigators who fabricated evidence against you. But the most shocking discovery came when federal agents analyzed Margaret's personal computers and phones. Hidden in encrypted files, they found something that made my blood run cold. Detailed surveillance reports about my daily routines, Grace's, pediatrician appointments, and even photographs taken with telephoto lenses of me pushing Grace in her stroller. She was conducting a full-scale intelligence operation against you, Agent Park explained when she showed me the files. She had people following you, documenting your activities, looking for any behavior she could twist to support her claims of instability. One file was labeled Operation Grandma and contained Margaret's actual plans for taking custody of Grace. It outlined strategies for having me declared mentally incompetent, contingency plans if the custody case failed, and even discuss relocating the asset, meaning Grace, to prevent me from regaining custody. This woman was planning to kidnap my daughter? I asked, horrified. That's certainly how we're interpreting relocating the asset, Agent Park confirmed. She had researched private schools in Switzerland and South America where wealthy families send children to avoid custody disputes. During our preparation sessions, I also learned the full scope of Margaret's gambling addiction. She'd lost over $2 million at high-end casinos in Las Vegas, Monte Carlo, and Atlantic City. When legitimate credit sources dried up, she turned to loan sharks and organized crime figures. The pressure from her gambling debts is what made her increasingly desperate, Ada Chen explained. By the time David died, she owed dangerous people serious money. She saw his inheritance as her salvation and you and Grace as obstacles to be removed. But perhaps the most heartbreaking discovery was a folder labeled David's Investigation. It contained copies of emails between David and his private investigator, showing that David had been planning to confront his mother after Grace was born. He'd hoped that becoming a grandmother might motivate her to get help and make restitution voluntarily. Your husband was trying to save his mother from herself, Ada Chen said gently. He wanted to give her a chance to come clean and get treatment for her gambling addiction. His death meant she never had to face the consequences of her actions until now. The defense team's strategy became clear during pretrial motions. They were claiming that Margaret was a grieving mother whose judgment had been impaired by loss, and that her actions toward me, while regrettable, were not criminal. They're going to paint you as a gold digger who manipulated a vulnerable young man, Sarah warned me. They'll claim that David's investigation into family finances was actually him trying to find ways to support your expensive lifestyle, but that's completely false. We have David's own words about why he started investigating. We do, but remember, the defense doesn't need to prove their version is true. They just need to create reasonable doubt about Margaret's intent. To counter this strategy, Ada Chen had assembled an impressive array of witnesses. Dr. Jennifer Walsh would testify about identity theft and medical fraud. Detective Reynolds would explain the systematic nature of Margaret's surveillance and harassment. James Chen would describe David's actual motivations for investigating his family's finances, but the star witness would be Lisa, who had secretly recorded several conversations with Margaret where she'd discussed her plans to neutralize the Emma problem. Aunt Margaret called me about 3 weeks after Grace was born, Lisa explained during her preparation session. She wanted to know if I thought you were showing signs of instability that could be documented. Would I refuse to spy on you? She got angry and said she'd find other ways to build her case. Lisa had started recording their conversations after that, creating a collection of evidence that painted Margaret as a calculating predator rather than a grieving mother. The defense team made one last attempt to avoid trial by offering a plea bargain. Margaret would plead guilty to embezzlement charges in exchange for a reduced sentence and dropping the racketeering counts related to her harassment of me. Absolutely not, I told Ada Chen when he presented the offer. She didn't just steal money, she tried to destroy my family. Other mothers need to see that there are consequences for this kind of abuse. I was hoping you'd say that, Ada Chen smiled. Because frankly, we want to take this case to trial too. Margaret Richardson represents everything wrong with people. who think money and connections put them above the law. As the trial date approached, I found myself thinking often about David and what he would have wanted. He loved his mother despite her flaws, but he'd also loved justice and protecting innocent people. I knew he would have wanted Margaret held accountable, not just for the money she'd stolen, but for the cruelty she'd shown to his wife and daughter the night before the trial began. I sat in Grace's nursery reading her a bedtime story. She was almost a year old now, walking with confidence and saying Mama and Dada with perfect clarity. When she said Dada, she'd point to David's photo, as if she somehow knew who he was. Tomorrow we're going to tell everyone the truth about what happened to us, I whispered to her as she fell asleep. And when it's all over, we're going to make sure every child who should have benefited from that stolen money gets the help they deserve. Grace smiled in her sleep, and I felt David's presence so strongly. It was almost like he was sitting beside us, ready to see justice finally served. The federal courthouse was packed on the first day of United States v. Margaret Richardson. Media outlets had picked up the story of the wealthy Chicago socialite who'd allegedly stolen millions from children's charities, and the courtroom gallery was filled with reporters, victims' families, and curious onlookers. I sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, Grace on my lap, quietly playing with a soft toy. She'd insisted on coming well, as much as a 1-year-old can insist on anything, and Ada Chun thought her presence would remind the jury what Margaret had tried to destroy. Margaret entered the courtroom in handcuffs, wearing an orange jumpsuit that was a far cry from her usual designer outfits. She'd aged dramatically during her months in federal custody, her silver hair now completely gray, and her face drawn with stress. When she saw me holding Grace, her expression twisted with such hatred that several jurors noticed and looked disturbed. Patricia Williams was known for running a no-nonsense courtroom, and she made it clear from the opening. Statements that she wouldn't tolerate any theatrics or delay tactics. Ada Chun's opening statement was devastating. He walked the jury through Margaret's 8-year crime spree, from the first diverted charity donation to her final desperate attempt to steal David's inheritance while destroying his family. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about greed, he began. Pure, unchecked greed that led a woman to steal money meant for dying children, to fabricate evidence against her own daughter-in-law, and to attempt to kidnap her own granddaughter to cover up her crimes. He showed the jury photos of the children's cancer ward that had to close a wing due to lack of funding that had been donated but diverted into Margaret's personal accounts. He displayed the fake medical records she'd created to make me appear mentally unstable. He played excerpts from the recording where she admitted to fabricating evidence. Margaret Richardson didn't just steal money, Ada Chun continued. She stole hope from families fighting for their children's lives. She stole peace from a grieving widow. And she tried to steal a baby from her own mother to silence the one person who could expose her crimes. Margaret's defense attorney, Richard Blackwood, tried to paint her as a grieving mother whose judgment had been clouded by loss. But it was clear he was working with impossible facts. My client loved her son deeply, Blackwood argued. When David died, she was devastated, and yes, her behavior toward his widow was inappropriate. But grief makes people do irrational things. Margaret Richardson is not a criminal mastermind. She's a broken woman who made poor decisions while overwhelmed by loss. But Ada Chun had structured the prosecution case to demolish that narrative completely. The first week of testimony focused on the charity fraud. Representatives from the Children's Hospital, the Cancer Research Foundation, and the educational nonprofit testified about promises Margaret had made and donations that never materialized. The numbers were staggering: medical equipment that couldn't be purchased, research projects that had to be canceled, scholarships that disappeared. Dr. Sarah Martinez from Children's Memorial testified about the cancer treatment program that had to be suspended when expected funding vanished. We had to tell 37 families that their children's experimental treatments would be delayed indefinitely. She said, her voice breaking. Some of those children died waiting for treatments that could have been funded with the money Margaret Richardson stole. The financial evidence was overwhelming. Federal forensic accountants walked the jury through a maze of shell companies, fake charities, and diverted funds that all led back to Margaret's personal accounts. They showed casino records documenting her massive gambling losses and loan, documents connecting her to organized crime figures, but the most powerful testimony came during the second week, when the focus shifted to Margaret's crimes against my family. Detective Reynolds presented the surveillance evidence, hundreds of photographs Margaret had commissioned of me and Grace, detailed reports about our daily routines and analysis of our vulnerabilities. Mrs. Richardson wasn't just harassing her daughter-in-law, Detective Reynolds testified. She was conducting military-level intelligence gathering in preparation for what can only be described as a family destruction campaign. When I took the stand, Adia Chun walked me through the entire nightmare, from Margaret's cruel words at David's funeral to her systematic campaign to have me declared unfit, to her threats to take Grace away from me permanently. Mrs. Richardson, in your own words, please tell the jury what Margaret Richardson said to you at your husband's funeral. I looked directly at the jury, then at Margaret, who was staring at me with undisguised hatred. She said that my baby was the mistake that killed our son, and that if I hadn't gotten pregnant, David would still be alive. How did that make you feel? Devastated. I was 6 months pregnant, grieving my husband, and his mother was telling me that our child, David's child, was responsible for his death. The cross-examination was brutal. Margaret's attorney tried to make me appear vindictive and money-hungry, suggesting that I'd fabricated evidence to steal David's inheritance. Isn't it true, Mrs. Richardson, that you were struggling financially before your husband's death? No, that's not true. David and I were financially stable. We had savings, investments, and he had excellent life insurance. But you were living in a house that didn't belong to you, weren't you? The house belonged to both of us. David and I owned it jointly, which is documented in the deed and confirmed by our attorney. Blackwood tried to suggest that I'd manipulated David into investigating his family's finances, but Ada Chen objected successfully, and the judge sustained it. The most dramatic moment came when they played the recording from our cafe meeting. Margaret's voice filled the courtroom coldly, discussing her plans to erase me from the family and her admission that she'd fabricated evidence against me. That baby belongs with her real family, Margaret's recorded voice said, and I saw several jurors look at Grace, who was sitting quietly with Lisa in the gallery. When the defense played their version of events, Margaret as a grieving mother, driven to poor decisions by lost Lisa's testimony, destroyed it completely. Aunt Margaret wasn't grieving, Lisa said firmly. She was calculating. She told me that Emma was a problem that needed to be solved and that she had plans to take care of the situation. This wasn't grief. This was a business decision to eliminate obstacles to her financial schemes. The final blow came when Ada Chen introduced Margaret's Operation Grandma files, showing her detailed plans to kidnap Grace if the custody case failed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ada Chen said during his closing argument, "you've seen the evidence of Margaret Richardson's systematic destruction of innocent lives in service of her greed. She stole from dying children. She terrorized a grieving widow. She attempted to kidnap a baby. This isn't grief. This is evil." Margaret's attorney made one last desperate attempt to humanize her, showing photos of her with David as a child and talking about her charitable work before her crimes began. But the evidence was overwhelming. During deliberations, which lasted only 6 hours, I waited in a conference room with Sarah and Ada Chen, Grace playing on the floor with toys that kind victims' families had brought for her. "Whatever happens," Sarah said, You've already won the most important victory. Grace is safe, your inheritance is secure, and Margaret will never be able to threaten your family again. When the jury returned with their verdict, Margaret stood to hear her fate. The foreman, a middle-aged man who'd looked increasingly angry throughout the trial, read the charges. On the count of racketeering, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. The verdict continued guilty on all 23 counts. Margaret Richardson was facing life in federal prison. As the judge thanked the jury and set a sentencing date, Margaret turned to look at me one final time. But instead of hatred, I saw something that might have been defeat. Or maybe even understanding. Grace babbled happily in my arms, reaching toward the light streaming through the courthouse windows, completely unaware that the woman who tried to destroy our family would never threaten us again. The sentencing hearing took place on a cold January morning, exactly 1 year after Grace's birth. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. My daughter's first birthday had been a celebration of life and hope, while Margaret's sentencing would mark the end of the nightmare that had dominated our lives. The courtroom was packed again, but this time the gallery was filled primarily with victims of Margaret's crimes. Families whose children had suffered because medical research funding disappeared, parents whose kids lost educational opportunities, and representatives from the charities she defrauded all came to see justice served. Judge Williams had received dozens of victim impact statements, and she planned to hear several of them before announcing Margaret's sentence. Dr. Sarah Martinez from Children's Memorial spoke first, her voice steady but emotional as she described the real-world impact of Margaret's theft. Your Honor, 7 children died waiting for cancer treatments that could have been funded with the money Margaret Richardson stole. Their families trusted our foundation to use their donations to save lives. And instead, that money went to casinos and luxury purchases. She showed photos of some of the children's beautiful faces full of hope and determination. Children who might have lived if Margaret hadn't diverted their treatment funding to feed her gambling addiction. A mother named Janet Williams spoke about her son Tommy, who'd been promised a special education scholarship that vanished when Margaret stole the program's funding. Tommy has autism and needed specialized tutoring to succeed in school. She testified. We were told the scholarship would cover his entire education. Instead, we had to mortgage our house to pay for his needs while Margaret Richardson bought jewelry and vacations with money meant for children like him. When it was my turn to speak, I stood with Grace in my arms. She was walking confidently now and had insisted on helping me carry the speech I'd written. Judge Williams smiled when Grace waved at her from the podium. Your Honor, Margaret Richardson didn't just steal money from me, she tried to steal my child's future. She wanted Grace to grow up believing that her father died because of her existence, that she was unwanted and unloved. She fabricated medical records to make me appear mentally ill. She hired criminals to create false evidence against me. She planned to kidnap my daughter if her legal schemes failed. I looked directly at Margaret, who sat at the defense table, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. But perhaps worst of all, she dishonored her son's memory. David loved me and Grace with his whole heart. He protected us even after his death, leaving evidence that would expose his mother's crimes and keep us safe. Margaret tried to poison that love with lies, but she failed. Grace will grow up knowing exactly how much her daddy loved her, and she'll know that justice was served for his memory. Margaret's attorney made one final plea for leniency, arguing that his client was elderly and in poor health, that prison would essentially be a death sentence. Your Honor, Mrs. Richardson is 63 years old with significant medical conditions. She's already lost everything, her family, her reputation, her freedom. She poses no threat to society, and mercy would be appropriate in this case. But Judge Williams had clearly been affected by the victim testimony. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much human suffering caused by greed. Mrs. Richardson, you have been convicted of 23 felony counts involving the theft of over $12 million meant for some of society's most vulnerable members' sick children, disadvantaged students, and struggling families. But your crimes went beyond theft. You weaponized the legal system to terrorize a grieving widow and attempted to kidnap your own granddaughter to cover your tracks. Judge Williams paused, looking directly at Margaret. The court has reviewed your entire criminal scheme, from the first diverted charity donation 8 years ago to your final desperate attempt to destroy Emma Richardson's life. What emerges is a picture of someone who viewed other people's suffering as acceptable. Collateral damage in your personal financial crisis. You stole hope from dying children. You stole peace from a new mother. You stole innocence from your own granddaughter. These crimes demand significant punishment, not just to hold you accountable, but to send a message that our society will not tolerate the victimization of its most vulnerable members. The courtroom was completely silent as Judge Williams announced, "A sentence. Margaret Richardson, I hereby sentence you to 25 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You are ordered to pay full restitution to all victims, including punitive damages for the emotional distress you caused. Given your age and the length of this sentence, you will likely spend the remainder of your life in federal custody." Margaret's knees buckled, and her attorney had to help her remain standing. 25 years meant she would die in prison, but Judge Williams wasn't finished. Additionally, the court is ordering the immediate liquidation of all your assets, including your home, vehicles, investments, and personal property. The proceeds will be distributed to your victims, with priority given to the medical charities and educational programs you defrauded. She turned to address the courtroom full of victims. To the families who suffered because of this defendant's greed, I want you to know that justice delayed is not justice denied. The money stolen from your children will be returned with interest, and new funding will be established to ensure the programs you relied on continue their vital work. As the marshals prepared to lead Margaret away, she turned toward me one final time. For a moment, I thought she might try to speak, to offer some kind of apology or explanation. Instead, she just stared at Grace, who was clapping her hands and babbling happily, completely unaware of the gravity of the moment. "She never know you," I said quietly, just loud enough for Margaret to hear. "Grace will grow up free from your poison, surrounded by people who truly love her." Margaret's face crumpled, and for the first time since David's funeral, I saw genuine grief in her expression, not self-pity, but actual sorrow for everything she'd lost through her own choices. The marshals led her away, and I knew I would never see Margaret Richardson again. Outside the courthouse, Ada Chen held a press conference announcing that the restitution process would begin immediately. The seized assets would fund a new foundation called David's Legacy that would support the exact causes Margaret had defrauded children's medical research, educational programs for disadvantaged youth, and cancer treatment funding. This case represents more than just individual justice, Ada Chen told the gathered reporters. It demonstrates that no one, regardless of wealth or social standing, is above the law when they prey on society's most vulnerable members. As we left the courthouse, Grace safely strapped in her car seat and chattering about everything she'd seen, I felt a profound sense of closure. The woman who tried to destroy our family was gone forever, and David's memory was finally free from her lies and manipulation. That evening, Sarah called with the final financial details of the restitution settlement. "Emma, when all of Margaret's assets are liquidated, you and Grace will receive approximately $800,000 in restitution payments. Combined with David's life insurance, his trust fund, and the house, you're looking at total assets of well over $1 million. What about the other victims?" "They'll all receive full restitution too." Margaret had been living far beyond her means, but she'd also been hoarding assets in hidden accounts. The forensic accountants found enough to cover everyone's losses plus penalties. That night, I sat in David's office, looking at the photo on his desk while Grace played with blocks on the floor. She'd started saying "dada" more frequently lately, and she always pointed to his picture when she said it. "It's over, David," I said to his photo. "Margaret can never hurt us again. Grace is safe, our future is secure, and your memory is protected. You saved us, even after you were gone." Grace looked up at the sound of my voice, then crawled over to David's desk and pulled herself up to standing. She pointed at his photo and said, clear as day, "Dada love?" "Yes, sweetheart," I said, picking her up and holding her close. "Daddy loves us very much. And now everyone knows the truth about that love." As I tucked Grace into her crib that night, I realized that Margaret's greatest failure wasn't just her crimes or her cruelty. It was her complete inability to understand the power of genuine love. She'd seen David's devotion to his family as a weakness to exploit, not recognizing that love had given him the foresight to protect us and the strength to ensure justice would ultimately prevail. Margaret Richardson would spend the rest of her life in a federal prison cell, while Grace would grow up surrounded by love, security, and the knowledge that her father had been a hero who'd saved his family from the grave. 2 years after Margaret's sentencing, Grace and I had built a beautiful new life together. She was now 3 years old, full of energy and curiosity, with David's warm brown eyes and my stubborn streak. Every morning, she'd wake up asking to see Dada, and I'd show her the photo album we'd created together, filled with pictures of David and stories about how much he loved her before she was born. We'd moved to a smaller, cozier house in Evanston, closer to my school and Grace's daycare. The mansion in Winnetka had felt too big and held too many painful memories. Our new home was filled with laughter, finger paintings on the refrigerator, and the comfortable chaos of a toddler learning to navigate the world. I'd returned to teaching at Lincoln Elementary, where my colleagues and students had welcomed me back with open arms. Principal Johnson had been incredibly supportive throughout the legal proceedings, and the school district had even invited me to speak at conferences about overcoming family trauma and rebuilding after loss. Mrs. Richardson, Grace is doing so well in her pre-K program. Her teacher, Miss Sarah, told me during a parent conference, she's incredibly social and confident. You've done an amazing job helping her adjust after everything your family went through. Grace had no memory of the custody battle or Margaret's harassment. She'd been too young, and I intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. She knew that Grandma Margaret lived far away, and that we had our own special family with Aunt Lisa and our close friends who'd become chosen family. Lisa had become Grace's unofficial godmother and my closest confidant. She distanced herself from the Richardson family after Margaret's crimes were exposed, choosing instead to build a relationship with us based on love rather than obligation. "Emma, I need to tell you something," Lisa said one Saturday afternoon, as we watched Grace play at the park. "Uncle Robert wants to meet with you." My stomach tightened. Robert had been cleared of any involvement in Margaret's crimes, but I wasn't sure I was ready to have any contact with David's family. What does he want? To apologize? And to ask if he can have some kind of relationship with Grace. He's been in therapy since Margaret's arrest, trying to understand how he missed so many signs of her criminal behavior. He feels terrible about what she put you through. I watched Grace on the swing set, her delighted laughter filling the air as she demanded to go higher, higher. The thought of exposing her to any more Richardson family drama made me protective, but I also knew that Robert was her grandfather and David's father. "What do you think I should do?" "I think you should meet with him, but on your terms. Maybe start with just a conversation, see if he's genuinely changed, or if he's just trying to ease his guilt." 3 weeks later, Robert and I met at a quiet coffee shop downtown. He looked older than I remembered, his hair completely gray, and his face lined with what appeared to be genuine remorse. "Emma, I don't know how to begin apologizing for what my wife did to you and Grace," he said without preamble. I was so blind, so caught up in my own grief over David that I didn't see the monster Margaret had become. "Robert, I appreciate you reaching out, but I need to know. Did you really not know about any of it? The embezzlement, the harassment, the fabricated evidence. I swear to you, I had no idea. Margaret handled all our charitable work, all our family finances. I was completely focused on the business, trying to keep David's legacy alive in the company. When you started making accusations against her, I thought you were just a grieving widow looking for someone to blame." He pulled out a thick folder of documents. "After her arrest, I hired forensic accountants to review everything. Emma, she'd been stealing from me too. Over the years, she diverted nearly $1 million from my personal accounts to fund her gambling. I was as much a victim of her lies as you were." I looked through the documents, bank statements showing diverted funds, casino records Margaret had hidden, even forged contracts that had cost Robert's business hundreds of thousands of dollars. "I am not telling you this to excuse my failure to protect you," Robert continued. "I should have listened when you tried to tell me what she was doing. I should have investigated instead of dismissing your concerns. I failed David's family, and I failed his daughter. What do you want now, Robert?" "I want to be Grace's grandfather, if you'll let me. Not to replace anything or anyone, but to be a positive presence in her life. To tell her stories about her father that only I know. To make sure she understands that David came from a family that loved him, even if one member of that family lost her way completely." Over the following months, Robert proved his sincerity through his actions. He established a college fund for Grace with money from his own accounts. He donated to the David's Legacy Foundation in her honor. Most importantly, he respected every boundary I set and never pushed for more access than I was comfortable giving. Grace adored him from their first meeting. Grandpa Bob became a regular part of our lives, taking her to the zoo, reading stories about her daddy, and treating her with a gentle kindness that reminded me of David's better qualities. "Mama, Grandpa Bob says Daddy was brave like a superhero," Grace told me one evening after one of their visits. "Is that true?" "Yes, sweetheart. Daddy was very brave. He protected us even when he couldn't be here with us." The David's Legacy Foundation had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. The restitution money from Margaret's crimes had funded new cancer research programs, educational scholarships for disadvantaged children, and medical equipment for children's hospitals. Every year on David's birthday, we held a benefit dinner that raised additional funds for the causes he would have supported. "Mrs. Richardson, I wanted you to know that the scholarship program you established has now helped over 200 children receive the education they deserve," Dr. Williams from the Children's Foundation told me at our annual gala. "David would be so proud of what you've built in his memory." As Grace's 4th birthday approached, I realized how completely our lives had transformed. We were no longer defined by tragedy and trauma, but by love, growth, and hope for the future. Margaret's attempt to destroy us had ultimately made us stronger and more connected to our community. One evening, as I was tucking Grace into bed, she looked at David's photo on her nightstand and said something that took my breath away. "Mama, I had a dream about Daddy last night. He said he's happy we're safe and that he loves our new house." "What else did he say, sweetheart?" "He said thank you for keeping his promises." I kissed her forehead and turned off the light, thinking about all the promises David had kept through his careful planning and protective love. The promise to provide for us financially, the promise to keep us safe from his mother's cruelty, the promise that Grace would grow up knowing she was wanted and loved. As I looked through Grace's baby book that night, I found the letter David had written to her before his death, the one I'd been saving for when she was old enough to understand it. My beautiful daughter, it began. If you're reading this, it means something has happened to me. But I want you to know that leaving you and your mother is the hardest thing I've ever had to do. You were planned, you were wanted, and you are loved beyond measure. Your mama is the strongest, most loving woman I've ever known, and she raised you to be confident, kind, and brave. No matter what anyone tells you, you were never a mistake. You are the best part of me and your mother, and you represent all the hope and love we share. Take care of your mama for me, and remember that I'll always be watching over both of you. Someday, when Grace was older, I'd share this letter with her along with the full story of how her father's love had saved us from those who tried to destroy our family. But for now, it was enough that she was happy, healthy, and growing up surrounded by people who genuinely loved her. Margaret Richardson would spend the rest of her life in prison, but Grace would spend hers free from the poison of hatred and greed. David's legacy lived on not in the business empire his family had built, but in the foundation that helped vulnerable children and in the beautiful daughter who carried his love forward into the world. And every night, as I listened to Grace's peaceful breathing from her crib, I felt David's presence with us, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a continuing source of love and protection that would guide us through whatever challenges lay ahead. We had built something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy, and I knew that was exactly what David would have wanted for his girls.